Chapter 11 Glow Better. Taking care of all the kids didn't turn out to be that bad. All of them were well-behaved, and there weren't any that were really young, so no babies or toddlers. The youngest one out of the 6 kids was Lily's younger brother, who was 5, and my nephew Josh was only a little older at 6. Anna turned out to be the most troublesome and wouldn't stop bugging me all day. I was in charge of watching them, so I had to keep them in sight. It also kept me in sight of them. I had been practicing my magical skills while turning my skills on and off to train wisdom. I didn't have an axe to swing, so that left fortified body. The side effect of turning fortified body on was that mana illuminated my body as it was used to strengthen it. As soon as she saw that, it was like a shark to blood. "Come on, Uncle Topher. I want to see you glow," she would demand. Glow! And sometimes it was just a command. I looked to Jonathan for help since it was his daughter, and he just gave me a look that said, "That's your problem, buddy." The other kids liked to see me glow too, but Anna loved it. She thought it was the coolest thing ever. The day all went well until after lunch, and I heard Jonathan shouting. I walked over to see Anna crying and Jonathan yelling at her. I lingered at a distance to not intrude, but I was curious as to what happened to make Jonathan angry. He was usually a chill guy and rarely raised his voice. It ended not long after, and Anna ran crying away towards where I was. "Come here, sweetie." I knelt and beckoned her over. She took my invitation and walked into my arms. Lifting her was awkward with one working arm, but I managed. It took her a minute to calm down and peel her face away from where it was buried in my shirt. The whole time I was making soothing gestures and saying calming words. There, it's all right. Why don't you tell me what happened?" I asked after she calmed down. I don't know. Sniffle. "I found Daddy lying down in our tent. Cough. And I wanted him to play with me. I ran up and jumped on him to get his attention, and he just started yelling at me." She was still working through her emotions, so it was hard to make out the words from the sniffling and coughing. I know what happened. She wanted her dad to play with her, so she ran up and jumped on him to make him get up. Ran and jumped full force onto his leg, which hadn't healed yet. That must have been painful. "It's okay, honey. He's not mad at you, he's just not feeling good right now," I said while patting her on the back. "It's not your fault. You just have to be more careful." It took a moment for her to calm the rest of the way down, and by that point, a handful of people had made it back to camp for our group training. I spotted Austin walking in and got an idea. "Hey, Anna," I whispered in her ear. "What?" she said back. "You know who else can glow?" I said. That got her to perk up. "Who?" she asked excitedly. "Cousin Austin," I answered. By that point, I had made my way over to him with Anna in my arms. He couldn't hear what we were saying, so he had no idea what was going on. He gave me a questioning look when he saw Anna had been crying, but I just shook my head to have him drop it. Anna whipped around so fast I almost dropped her before shouting at Austin, "You can glow too!" "What are you talking about? I can't glow." Austin looked confused. "Activate fortified body," I told him. He still didn't quite understand what we were getting at, but he complied with my request. After activating the skill, he started to subtly glow from the mana. "You liar! You can glow!" Anna chastised. I guess I can. I never really noticed it," he said while looking down at his hands. "How come he glows a different color than you?" Anna said while pointing at Austin. Now that she had asked, I realized I didn't have an answer for her. I had noticed it before, and at the time I hadn't really thought much about it. Being in the middle of a battle with a boar took my attention away from the odd detail. Later, when I would have thought more about it, I had already forgotten. It was not at the top of my list of importance. I couldn't just tell her I didn't know either, so I had to come up with something. If I just said, "I don't know," not only would it shatter my all-knowing persona, it would have her guess at the reason for hours. There was no telling when she would get distracted and focus on something else. Racking my brain for anything that could be remotely plausible resulted in nothing. I had no clue why it was different colors. The only thing that I kept coming back to was that our mana was different colors. That didn't really fix the issue, though. If I said that our mana was different colors, she would just ask why, which would bring us right back to square one. I looked to Austin for help, but he was useless. He looked like he was more confused about it than Anna was. I went with an answer that could only satisfy a child. It's because I'm better than him, that's why I glow in a prettier color. That was entirely subjective, but it was true. I glowed in a nice light blue color which was pleasing to look at. Austin glowed yellow. If we weren't fighting for survival, I might have made fun of him for looking like a sunflower. The way the mana expelled from his head framed it in a circle around his face that looked like a sunflower, which was pretty funny. It was entirely my own opinion, but blue was better than yellow. Anna just nodded like what I said was fact and was not just made up on the spot. Austin looked aggrieved when Anna just agreed with me and put his hand to his chest in mock hurt. Yellow is a way better color than blue. It's the color of the sun, and what's prettier than the sun? Austin pleaded his case, but Anna wasn't having it. Her favorite color was blue, so it was a losing battle. He would never convince her yellow was better. What followed was the most childish argument ever. It had a lot of no's, followed by no blue is better countered by no yellow is better. It worked to cheer her up, and that was the purpose of it. It got so far as her having us stand next to each other to compare who glowed better. How one could glow better I had no idea, but she was determined to find the answer. Austin and I continued playing around with Anna, and the other kids joined in when they saw us playing, and it turned into a mosh pit of little kids trying to tackle us. It was a nice way to blow off some steam and release some of the tension that was in the air after yesterday. It came to an end when something unexpected happened. It started raining. I don't know why it was so unexpected to see it start raining, but it was. When you think of all the fantasy movies and books, it seems to never happen. Rain was a natural process that happened all the time, but it just felt weird to think about it happening now. Our play session came to an end, and everyone who was in camp hurried to put anything that couldn't get wet under a roof so it could stay dry. By this point, we had made a number of different tents for everyone to sleep in, and people were stashing food, clothes, and perishables in them to keep them from getting ruined. I hesitate to call them tents when they were essentially teepees. We took several planks of wood, leaned them together in a cone shape, and tied them together at the top. We then covered the outside with the various hides that we had dried from the previous waves. Some of the tents had cloth that we bought from the store when we ran out of usable hides that were dried. It took a lot of effort to scrape the skinned hides clean before setting them out to dry, and involved a liberal use of cleanse to make sure there was nothing left behind. The tents made it so people had their own private space to sleep at night and get away from people for a while. The family's tents were a little bigger to accommodate the extra people that they needed to house. Mine was small. I was one of the few who were alone, and my tent reflected that. Austin was another who was alone and had a small tent, and we made the joke that we should conjoin ours together to make a super tent, but we never got around to it. Dinner had to be moved to the bunker that we made for the kids, since it was the only thing big enough to cook in that was sheltered from the rain. It forced everyone into a cramped space to eat, but that was manageable. It also forced the people who were bickering yesterday into close proximity with each other. Nothing ended up happening, which was good. The tasty meal might have something to do with it. The deer was delicious. Hal wasn't the only hunter in the family, and this wasn't the first time that we had cooked venison for a family gathering, and that was reflected in the meal. We didn't have any stoves or any modern kitchen appliances, but the chefs made it work with the skillets and pots that we had. After dinner, the total points for the wall were tallied, with the result being 2,976/5,000. The first wave had 211 points towards the wall, 945 for the second, followed by a whopping 1820 for the third. We only had about 2,000 to go. If the trend continued, we would get it next wave and have some left over. Seeing how close we were lifted people's spirits and lessened the pessimism going around. Anytime a healer was full on mana, they would use their skills on the 4 of us that were still wounded. Ashley ended up getting meditation for her third skill, and she proved how effective it was. She was using her skills at least 25% more than the rest of the healers. She could only use meditation so often throughout the day, or that percentage would be higher. Abigail was the one whose healing did the most for my arm, but the other skills still worked. Abigail rotated through healing Scott, Mitchell, and me, so all of us would get some healing. My vitality stat wasn't high enough to reduce the time it took for a broken bone to heal to hours, but I could feel it working. If there weren't any healers, I think it would have taken a month to heal on my own. It was an extremely quick time given that it would have taken 3 or 4 months before the tutorial. Jonathan was the first to be completely healed, and after there were only 3 patients to 4 healers, it went a lot faster. The sling was removed after dinner, but I still had to be ginger with it and limit strenuous activities. I couldn't go lifting boulders or anything. When it came time to go to bed, I was so happy that someone had the great idea to make cots so we didn't have to sleep on the ground. They weren't comfortable or anything, but what they were was elevated from the ground. The cots were made for the cold rather than the rain, but it worked for both. Since it was still late winter/early spring, there was still a chill in the air. I wouldn't say that it was freezing, but the first night was particularly unpleasant. The cots got us off the ground so that we could retain our body heat better without the ground sucking it out of us. The hides that were in the best shape were sewn together into blankets, which helped. The kids got the blankets first, but after the second wave, there were enough to go around to anybody that needed one. Some people spent some of their points to buy a blanket since they found the hides uncomfortable. I wasn't of the opinion that it was a good use of points, so I refrained from doing that. I didn't say anything since it was their points, they could do whatever they wanted with them, I just thought it was a waste. The rain broke over the course of the night, and I woke to the clear skies of day 9. There was a notification for an increase of 4 stats this morning, which was a lot compared to previous days and a great notification to wake up to. I even got my first increase in acumen from the magic training I did yesterday. Fortitude and vitality got an increase from all the healing I had done over the past day, bringing them to 13 and 15 respectively, with wisdom and acumen reaching 8 and 7. I guess bones really do grow back stronger. I had to check the tutorial screen for the timer to confirm what day it was. All of the days seemed to blend together. It was surprising to realize that there would be another wave tomorrow. It felt like we just got done with the last wave yesterday. Losing one of the 2 days in between waves to healing sucked. Getting up to work revealed that the ground was still wet from the weather yesterday, but that wasn't anything we couldn't handle at this point. It did leave a slight fog that had rolled in when the temperature dropped, but that should go away over the course of the day. There was a pleasant smell of damp grass mixed with the chill in the air that made me want to stay by the campfire curled up with a blanket. With my arm healed, I didn't have that option, which was unfortunate. I was once again relegated to tree-cutting duty. We had used all of our lumber to make the spike walls we deployed, and since they had worked so well, we planned to make more before the next wave came. By this point, I could chop trees with my eyes closed. I had been doing it so long, and it freed up my attention to practice the magic exercises while working. Since I didn't have the chance to train my physical skills yesterday, I took the time to get a workout in during the day and did dexterity tricks to train agility when I could. I didn't bother with perception training, deciding to focus on strength and agility before the wave tomorrow. We still couldn't be 100% sure that tomorrow's wave was going to come from the north, but we were reasonably sure it would. Most of the spikes we built were positioned already facing that way, and if we had to move them, then so be it. We also added some traps so that when the beasts came up the hill, they would have to contend with those as well. We didn't have the time to dig a trench, but once the wall was purchased, that was one of the first things that we were going to use our manpower for. The traps were basically potholes along the path coming up the hill from the north. Some had spikes at the bottom, but most didn't. We didn't have the time to dig them and line them with spikes, and it was decided the holes were more important, so we focused on those. None of the rangers picked a trap-making skill, so it was all just good old-fashioned hard work and elbow grease. Hal, Austin, and I were all digging one of the holes together, and Austin made a joke about it to Hal, saying we wouldn't have had to do this if he picked a trap-making skill. Hal then divulged what he picked for his new skill, and we couldn't much blame him. He picked tracking common as his first skill before he knew he wouldn't have to hunt for food. He thought he was going to be sent off to a forest where he would have to survive alone, and based all his decisions on that. The bow for hunting and tracking to find prey. After knowing what the tutorial entailed, he picked precision shot for his second skill and had 2 different skills he had to decide between for his third. One of them was power shot, which, much like my own skill, added strength to his arrows by infusing them with mana. The other skill he was debating with was the skill my Aunt Carrie took. Splitting shot. Why is it between those 2? Why don't you pick something else like Kyle? He hasn't picked a bow skill at all. Austin said after Hal mentioned his skill choice. That's because Kyle isn't thinking right. He keeps fantasizing about what he wants to do and what he wants his class to evolve into without thinking about surviving the next wave. He took Ranger's Eye so he could find an animal to tame, and he picked Forager's Sense because my dad talked him into it. We had no other food sources besides meat and needed to know if the plants in the forest were edible, and that skill was one of the only ones that would do that. He also refused to get a bow skill because he didn't want it influencing his class evolution. Hal basically spat out. I could tell that he had strong feelings about his brother's skill choices. Does he even know what level class evolutions are at? I wasn't even thinking that far ahead yet. I said, "Oh, you know, Kyle, he'll sit and math anything out with enough variables." He questioned his guide extensively to get as much information as possible to min/max his choices. He found out that you get 6 skills per class rank, and since we got a starting skill at level 1 and our next at levels 2 and 4, he extrapolated out the next 3 skills at levels 6, 8, and 10. With getting the last skill at level 10, he figured that's when the first class evolution is. Hal sighed and shook his head before adding, "It's a wonder how his mind works, but he uses it for the weirdest things." Austin and I both laughed at that. Kyle was an odd one growing up. He loved video games and puzzles, and he was always doing one of the two until his mom would drag him away to join in the family activities. I once asked him how he was doing at Christmas, and he then took the next 30 minutes to describe in great detail the way an engine worked. How we got on the topic of how engines work, I'll never understand. The funniest part was I already knew how they worked. "Well, don't leave us in suspense. What did you pick?" Austin said. "Power shot is a better single target skill, and that's not what we have to worry about for the waves. So I picked splitting shot." Aunt Carrie walked me through how it works, and it seemed like the best choice. You use your mana to split the arrow mid-flight, so when it comes down it can hit multiple enemies. Aunt Carrie can already split it into 4 arrows from all the practicing. I can only split it into 2 still. Hal said. That was a great skill to have for the waves. With our lack of rangers, we missed out on killing some of the beasts at long range before they got to us. If Hal and Carrie could both split their arrows into 4, then we would have 9 arrows per volley instead of the 3 we started with. After Hal told us about his new skill, Austin and I both told him about ours. Austin got Extended Strike, which added length to his spear strikes so he could stand behind the spikes and stab through them into the beasts without having to leave cover. After Jack had mentioned he could use both his skills at the same time when we went hunting, it prompted Austin to get the skill to use with the skill he already had, Piercing Strike. We continued chatting while working, and soon it was time for dinner. Thinking about the dinner yesterday had my mouth watering, and I may have rushed a little on my way back when I heard it was ready. Chapter 12, To Whom the Bell. Dinner was just as good as the previous days and went by quickly. We used the hours until sundown to make sure that everything was ready for the wave the coming morning. There would still be a few hours between sunrise and noon that we could use to finalize everything in the morning, but it didn't hurt to be thorough. We had more spikes than last time and added traps up the hill. We also made more javelins for if we needed them, all the while keeping up with the daily training. We usually did an hour of group combat and another hour for stat training. We also used this time to ask others for help with various topics. Some were unnaturally good with some of the weapons we were given, although I knew for a fact that they had never used them before. Others were naturally gifted in the magic side of things, and that's where I spent the majority of my time. The person who was the best with training mana skills was our only fire mage, Rachel. Braden's wife was a natural when it came to the magical side of things. She claimed that she'd increased all 3 of her magical stats by at least 3 each. I hadn't even gotten a point in intelligence, and she's already gotten 3. I felt miffed. I wasn't the only one struggling with the mana skills, luckily, and she would try to walk all of us through the way that she handled mana to help us improve. It wasn't the best mentorship, but it was better than nothing. Whenever I wouldn't get something, she would just say, "You just need to feel it, it feels like this." She would then describe what it felt like to her, which wasn't helpful. She kept saying that you had to guide the mana, you couldn't force it. I had no idea what she was talking about because I didn't feel like I was guiding my mana when I activated my skills. Others were equally as unhelpful. They would say that you asked the mana to do something and it would then do it. I thought they were joking with me at first, but when they were straight-faced and didn't laugh, I realized they were serious. I gave it a shot because why not, and it worked even worse than trying to guide it. Everyone had their own way of going about it, and I just hadn't found mine yet. I was holding out hope that I was just missing something, and once I found it, it would come instinctively, like with Rachel. If not, I was in for a long road of training. I was average with my axe and could use the shield pretty well at this point, so at least I had that going for me. When night fell and everyone was getting ready for bed, there was a nervousness in the air. Everyone knew what was in store for tomorrow. We've been through 3 of them so far. No matter how many times we faced a coming wave, I didn't think I would ever not be nervous. It was worse for me because my mind kept coming back to the memory of the boss charging me before I went flying. I wasn't having nightmares about it or anything, but there was no way I was going to forget that anytime soon. I didn't get to join the rest of my family going off to blissful sleep, for it was my turn for night watch. It wasn't the first time that I had done it, but it was the first time before a wave. We had a rotating watch, so you were on watch every other night, and with the waves coming every 3 days, I got away with not being on watch the night before one. I had my cousin Derek to keep me company, so I wasn't by myself, but he wasn't a very talkative person. He was younger than me by a few years, and he was my Uncle Scott's only child. Being an only child made Derek have some quirks that you had to get used to. He was a nice enough guy, but sometimes the way he acted made me want to throttle him. He wasn't taking this whole tutorial very well. He had never been the most talkative before this whole thing, and after, you were lucky to get a few sentences. He was one of the foolish who picked rogue as their starting class, but he at least had the wherewithal to pick dual short swords instead of daggers. They wouldn't give him a ton of extra reach, but at that range, every little bit helps. I didn't wish to sit here in awkward silence for the entire 2 hours, so I decided to start up a conversation with him. "How are you doing, Derek?" I said. "Fine. How about you?" he said back. Sometimes I wonder why we even ask that question to the people we see, because we are never going to get the real answer, and the times we do get the real answer, we were just asking to be nice, not hear your life story. "Oh, you know, keeping on," I said back comically. He snorted at that, but didn't volunteer anything else. We sat in silence for a moment or two before he said something again. "I feel like I should be waking up to go to school tomorrow, not to face down a horde of monsters. These were supposed to be my best years, but I didn't even get to finish my freshman year of college," he said. School. I hadn't thought much about it since the tutorial started, but he was right. If this had never happened, I would be waking up to go to class tomorrow. I was most of the way through my degree, and I would never get to finish. All of that money wasted. College was a scam anyway, but I still wanted to finish, if nothing else than to say that I did it. I guess I won't have to pay back my student loans. Take that, you see. I know it's petty to think that after the world essentially ended, but I'd take whatever I could when it comes to not paying money for college. The amount they nickel and dime you for every little thing was astronomical. Soon it would have cost millions to go to school. I dismissed those thoughts as thinking about them wasn't relevant anymore. There wouldn't be any colleges by the time we got back, and there wasn't a point, but if I ever saw my college president when we got back to Earth, I was going to smack him around a little for being a greedy little shit. Derek and I continued to chat throughout our shift, which made the time go by faster. We didn't talk about anything deep, just chit-chatting about various things, different college stories we had, and memories we were fond of. The time came to wake up the next shift of people, and Derek and I parted ways. I woke up my Uncle Mark for his shift before going back to my tent to sleep. My nerves kept me awake for a while, but eventually exhaustion got the better of them. Waking up, I quickly checked for a training notification to see which stats I increased. The only one I received an increase in was wisdom. I thought for sure that I would get an increase in strength after my workout yesterday, but it wasn't there. I took a minute to look over my status sheet and see the improvements. I could only hope it was enough for the wave to come. Name, Christopher Zelensky. Race, human. Age, class warrior level 4. Profession, none. Faction, Zelensky family, temporary. Strength 19. Agility 9. Perception 10. Fortitude 13. Endurance 13. Vitality 15. Intelligence 8. Wisdom 9. Acumen 7. Free points 0. Laws none. Skills: power strike, fortified body, throwing weapon proficiency, beginner. Coins 0. Points 103. My strength had more than doubled since the beginning, and my wisdom was 1 point shy of doubling as well. My endurance more than doubled from the measly 5 that it started at, and vitality and fortitude both increased by 6. It was good progress, I felt. After breakfast, we spent most of our time making sure everything was ready and all our preparations were in place. A few more holes were dug for good measure, but we didn't have the time to do anything big. We were as ready as we were going to be. Time seemed to evaporate, and it was soon a couple minutes before noon. All of my family were standing around the pylon with all their gear and weapons ready for what was to come. We all formed up facing the north, but we were ready to move on the off chance that we were wrong. No one had the courage to start a conversation before the wave started, so we stood in silence. The kids were already in the bunker since everything was already where it needed to be, and they didn't have to help move anything. My javelin stack had grown, so now there were 5 of them at my feet and 1 in my hand. I was one of the only ones who took a throwing skill, and it showed in the distance I could now reach. I could now easily clear the 100-foot marker with ease, using a combination of my strength and the skill adding to the speed of the throw. Olympic athletes could throw a javelin over 300 feet, and we couldn't get close to that yet. With practice, we extended our range, but it wasn't close to 300. Those athletes spent most of their lives training in the technique it takes to throw and growing muscles specifically to be able to throw further. Most of our would-be Olympians came from a regular 9 to 5 office job that required little in the ways of javelin throwing. We had also only practiced throwing one for about a week. The first marker was moved to around 150 feet, with more filling in the distance back to us. If I gave it my all, I could reach about 250 feet, but that was with a running start that would hinder my speed in reloading. When we were practicing, I could always tell which javelin was mine in the air because it flew the fastest and went the furthest. I had to keep adjusting how hard I threw to make sure that I landed with the rest of the grouping. Granddad saw how far I could throw and gave me the go-ahead to start when the monsters were further out than when the rest of them started. I would start with the mages, who had a range of about 200 feet, 65 yards. It wasn't much longer until we heard the notification chime. Defend your claim. Wave start. 0:59. The wave started after the minute was up, and we were right. It came from the north. Kyle shouted out the information, and there were some grim faces when we heard the news. Boars. It was a herd of boars. There were fewer in number than the deer of the last wave, but they were considerably more lethal. They had the normal increase in level, so it was a mix of level 4s and 5s, and the boss was a level 9 behemoth of a thing. It looked like the size of a pickup truck and was threaded with muscle. The monstrosity had tusks shooting out of its mouth to either side that extended 3 feet in either direction. I could see based on the fidgeting that people were nervous. Heck, I was nervous. This was going to be difficult. It didn't help matters that when the boars started to charge, there was a rhythmic thumping as they got closer. People's nerves got worse as the thumping got louder and louder, so Granddad took the time to give us a motivational speech. There's no need to be worried, we've done this before. We practiced for this and have trained for this. Your body knows what to do, you just need to let it and not let your mind make mistakes, he said. It wasn't the best speech, but it was better than nothing. The Rangers fired, followed by the mages. I threw all of my javelins, and so did the rest of the family. The results were disappointing. Where a javelin would hit a deer and make it fall over dead, it just wounded the boars. Where magic explosions would send deer tumbling about with grievous wounds, the boars were staggered. It took the collective effort of multiple volleys before the first casualty was made. This was not going well. The obstacle that caused the most damage to the charging boars was the potholes. When one of them hit the potholes, they went down hard. Limbs broke and they were slow to get back up, and that was if they could. The only problem was we didn't have the time to dig that many. We didn't want to put all of our eggs in one basket, so there were some traps facing the other directions, and those wouldn't help us now. Most were still dug in the north, but there could have been more. The horde lost members, but I could tell it wasn't enough. They were coming, and all of our attacks wouldn't stop them. All I could do was watch as they got closer. All of my javelins were gone, used up already. I stood behind the spikes with my shield and axe at the ready. I was double the level since the last time I faced a boar and more experienced. I could only hope that it was enough. Some of the excitement that I felt last wave was coming back, but it was mixed with nervousness seeing that amount of mass charging towards me. The boars got closer and closer before ramming into the spikes in some kind of suicidal death charge. It was like they could see the enemy and it didn't matter what was in between it and them, it was going straight for them. The leading boars skewered themselves on the spikes and the ones behind followed suit a moment later. It was baffling to watch. They were running headlong into spikes. I had no idea what they were doing. There was no intelligence being shown, just madness. It happened when a third boar hit one section of spikes. A creaking sound followed by cracking. The spikes were not designed for this. They were designed to stop the leading charge of the wave, not take the collective charge of 3 or 4 boars. It was also not designed to hold the weight of 3 or 4 boars. The sections of spikes broke. Our defenses failed. The boars got through and all hell broke out. The spikes had done their job and stopped the charge, but they didn't provide cover anymore. Boars squeezed through the gaps where the broken sections were and started going to town. I couldn't focus on anything else at the moment. All I could do was focus on what was coming at me. I had to dodge in between boars and could only get a swing in occasionally when there was time. Boars were everywhere. People were everywhere. I had no idea what was going on and I could only try to keep myself alive. We outnumbered the boars who were left, but it didn't much matter when they were already behind our lines. Cut a leg here, fend off a tusk there, spin around and dodge a boar coming from behind me. What made it so hard was that the boars didn't pick someone and target them. They ran in loops, and whether they hit someone or missed, they continued on to the person behind them. Throughout the fighting, I got so turned around I didn't know which way was north anymore. I was bleeding from some wounds that grazed me when I either got caught off guard or when I couldn't dodge fast enough. The only hope I held on to was the fact that the boars were thinning out. The numbers were declining. I had fortified body on for as long as I could, and at this point I was running on fumes. I always had to keep track of the boss to make sure that I wouldn't get trampled, but that was easy as the thing towered over the rest of the boars. Another thing that made it easy to track was that it caused havoc wherever it went. I caught sight of one of the healers dragging someone out of the carnage and could only pray that they would be okay. It took what felt like forever to whittle it down so that only the boss was left. There were only a handful of people that were still in fighting shape. There were bodies of boars everywhere and some people with them. Healers were going around to the downed people and pulling them away from the boss, healing them as much as they could. My grandfather, my dad, Jonathan, and I, with a few other family members, surrounded the boss and started wearing it down. One of the rangers was still up because an arrow would thud into the beast occasionally. We couldn't face it head-on, so we had to skirt around it to keep it from charging us. We were taking turns swiping at it when someone said, "Step back from it." We all complied quickly before a fire bolt bigger than any I had seen smashed right into its mouth. It exploded with more force than I thought possible, and half of the boar's head was blown off, resulting in the boss falling to the ground dead. The chimes rolled in now that we were out of combat, but I ignored them to turn around to see 4 of the mages huffing and puffing in exertion. It must have taken all their mana to do that. What was that? How did you do that? I don't know who said it, but I was asking myself the same thing. Rachel, the fire mage, held up a finger to give her a minute before speaking. When I was practicing mana control, I found out that mages could work together to cast spells. With all the rest of my mana, I cast Fire Bolt and combined it with their mana bolts. Together it created that. She said, gesturing to the point of explosion. The notifications were still waiting to be read, but I ignored them. There were things to do that were more important. All right, everyone who can still move, bring the injured to the hospital. And if it looks like you shouldn't move them, call a healer over. Granddad yelled out. People didn't need to be told twice and started going around to the injured. Took a while to get to everyone, but we didn't stop. Even though my body was screaming at me that it needed rest, I pushed through it. There were extensive injuries, and everyone had at least something that needed healing. I was bleeding from a few wounds, and I was one of the better off. I had learned my lesson and was a lot more careful this wave. It took hours to get everyone stable, and there were a few close calls when the healers ran out of mana. But they did it. They rationed it better this wave, but there were still too many injuries. Since we knew that this wave was going to be worse than last time, some of the points were used to buy healing potions from the store. They were expensive at over 100 points each, but they were worth it. Some of us would have died without them. We had to dip into our personal points to afford it, but we felt it was worth it. Watching them take effect was fascinating. It worked so much faster than the healer's skills did and closed wounds in the blink of an eye. All of us finally sat down to catch our breath when my Uncle Scott said, "Where's Derek?" Oh no. All of us looked around and couldn't find him anywhere. After we couldn't find him in camp, we all went to search the battlefield. I was looking everywhere around the battlefield when I heard a scream. "No!" Everyone rushed to the noise. I came running to the scene to find Scott rolling a boar off of Derek's body. He wasn't moving. "Heal him. Give me a potion." Scott started screaming as he frantically tried to save his son. Ashley pressed her glowing hands to Derek's body, but nothing happened. The healing energy just dissipated. The potion didn't do anything either. Derek was dead. Chapter 13 Morning. It didn't feel real. I had just talked to him last night and now he was dead. His body just lay there, unmoving like a marble statue staring into the distance. The sound of Scott sobbing while holding on to his son's body was the only noise as everyone sat in silence. Diana's cries soon joined in creating a sad melody of a lost child. It was heart-wrenching to watch as the two parents grieved for their son. Derek was their only child and now they had none. When so many of the family had numerous children, it was odd that Scott and Diana had only had one. Neither of them was inclined to have any more after the problems that occurred with having Derek. Diana's pregnancy was rough and they didn't want to go through that again, so that left Derek to be their sole child. My mind became a haze after finding the body. My body went through the motions, but my mind was elsewhere. Someone had died and I kept wondering who would be next. It wasn't a question of if anymore, it was who. It felt shitty to hope that it wouldn't be my sister or my father and wish for the demise of other family members, but a small part of me still did. Even though someone was dead, it didn't make the bodies go away. It didn't make the spikes rebuild themselves. It didn't butcher the boars for food. The world continued and we had to continue on with it. The parents were left to hold their son and the rest of us got to work. The bodies were moved and the debris was picked up. Arrows and javelins were collected. Ashley used cleanse on the blood and soon the battlefield was clean, except for the holes we dug and the divots from magical explosions. The grass was trampled and thrown up in spots, but there wasn't anything we could do about that. While we were cleaning up, Scott walked over to the hill adjacent to ours and started to dig. He said he wished to do it alone and everyone respected his wishes. Diana just sat next to where Derek was lying with a blank look on her face. Some tried to comfort her and be there for her, but it was like she wasn't even conscious, just staring off into space while she gently rubbed Derek's hand. We couldn't keep the kids in the bunker forever and they started to fuss about being left in there for so long. We kept them in there longer than we usually would since we didn't want them to see the body. It was inevitable that they would, but everyone was just putting it off until later. Nothing would change between then and now, so I thought it was best to rip the Band-Aid off. Then again, I didn't have kids and it wasn't my decision. My uncles got together and with some of the wood scraps that we had they built a coffin. It didn't look the best as it was made from all kinds of different wood and the mismatch of the pieces being all different sizes, but it was the thought that counted. The heartless side of my brain thought it was a waste of time, but I snuffed that thought out as soon as I had it. This wasn't for me, this was for Scott and Diana. Throughout it all the volume didn't go higher than a soft whisper. The sounds of the forest permeated the camp while we went about our work. After the coffin was finished and the hole was dug, we all gathered around to watch and give Derek a final send-off. It wasn't a fancy funeral procession, but I thought it was done with more care than some of the funerals I've been to before. The kids were brought out of the bunker and their parents had to give them the talk. Most wouldn't understand until later what it really meant to not see someone again. So with his family surrounding him, Derek was gently lifted and placed inside the coffin that was made for him. Scott and his brothers all grabbed a corner of the coffin and started their slow march to the adjacent hill where the grave was dug. Watching my father and uncles be the pallbearer for Derek was an experience I'd never thought I'd have. There were tears and crying that followed behind, and eventually, the procession ended at the grave. Scott cried the whole way while carrying his son to his final resting place. It was more tears than I had ever seen the man shed. Both parents gave a speech with warm words about what Derek wished for the future and his aspirations in life that wouldn't come to pass. It was a sad affair that lasted a couple of hours as we all took our time to come to terms with his death. It was improper to do, but Granddad ushered us back towards camp before we stayed too long. I saw where he was coming from, and we didn't have a lot of time to spend grieving. But what kind of world did we end up in if you were too busy to have a proper funeral? We slowly made our way back to camp, and the silence from before gradually lessened. The kids led the charge, getting the conversation going, and once it had, the quiet spell broke. Sounds of cooking followed after, and we stayed on happy topics for the course of dinner. Afterward, I finally opened the notifications for the previous battle. You have contributed in slaying Highland Boar, level 5. 8 points earned. You have contributed in slaying Highland Boar, level 4. 6 points earned. You have contributed in slaying Earthhide Boar, level 9. 12 points earned. You have successfully defended your claim. Extra experience awarded. 160 points to all who participated. Congratulations. You have leveled up. The notifications didn't feel the same now that one of us wouldn't receive them anymore. The excitement of improving was muted. As a group, we got over 6,000 points just from that wave alone, which was enough to buy the wall just from that. Now that we had enough points for the wall, we all congregated toward the pylon to see what would happen when we completed it. With the final point added, there was a bright flash of light followed by a rush of energy that exited out of the pylon. The energy rushed to the edges of our land and started morphing reality. I watched as what seemed like trees grew out of the earth at a speed visible to the naked eye. The tree had no leaves or branches on it, remaining a single straight trunk extruding out of the ground only to be joined by another log right next to it a moment later. It took mere moments, and where there was once nothing, a wooden palisade sprang from existence. Logs 2 feet in diameter encircled the camp in a protective shield of wood. After the logs finished growing upward, they were topped with a sharpened tip that peaked at 10 feet into the air. Before the energy dissipated, it culminated for the finale of the magical performance. Runes started to embed themselves onto the wood, which radiated a sense of power that was confounding to look at. It was like watching a law of physics being born, only we could watch it unfold as the magical circuits spread from log to log in a grand tapestry of magnificence. The engineer in me stirred to find out how this power worked, how it felt so real even though I hadn't a clue what the lines meant. The sense of wonder I felt at watching the events unfold completely drowned out the dark thoughts I had before. There was a childlike giddiness in me that wanted to go examine the lines in the wood. I clamped down on that urge before I acted, but I was definitely spending some time examining it later. When the runes completed, the edges of the wood drew together, and where one log met another it melded together so that there were no gaps to be seen. After the energy was gone, the glowing lines dimmed before retreating into the surface of the wood, hiding the magical aura it once had. Everyone took a second for their minds to comprehend what they just witnessed. The first to break the stunned silence was predictably one of the kids. "That was so cool!" Anna screamed out, pausing in between the words for emphasis. What followed was her chanting for them to do it again. I agreed with her and too wished to see it again. Before the excitement could go too far, we remembered the event we had just come from and toned it down. It felt wrong to have the emotions of the funeral followed by the light show we just witnessed. Everyone took a moment to walk the perimeter of the new addition and look over the wall that we purchased. Walking around revealed 4 large gates facing the cardinal directions. The gates opened out, away from the camp, and were quite heavy to move. To open them you had to remove the wooden bar that was used as a brace for the gates and set it aside. The gates extended up the height of the wall and were taller than they had any right to be. At 10 feet tall and 6 feet wide, the gates could welcome a giant into the camp and it wouldn't have any problems. As I was walking around the wall, I tried to examine the runes that I had seen before, but I couldn't sense them no matter how hard I tried. It was disappointing to know that they were there but had no way to see them. As a group, we did some tests to see how sturdy the thing was, and the results were shocking. Even if all of us pushed on the gate together, the thing didn't budge an inch. Someone tried to climb it and didn't make any progress before falling back down. There were no places to use as handholds, and the wood was too strong to use a weapon to dig one out. It would take far more power than we had to climb it. Since we tested the possibility of going through it and then over it, it only left the possibility of digging under it. Digging up the earth at the base of the wall revealed that the logs extended deeper into the ground than what was initially believed. With our tests completed, confidence started to come back to us after our defenses had failed after the last wave. It felt like this thing could stop the charge of the boss flat without even breaking a sweat. The new addition happened right when we needed it most. There was no way we would be able to rebuild all of the defenses that broke before the next wave came. It took a while for the curiosity of the new addition to die down, but eventually, everyone returned to camp and settled in for rest as the sun dipped below the horizon. Lying alone in my tent gave my mind the needed chance to catch up to all of the events that unfolded over the course of the day, and when it finally did, the sheer magnitude of events finally hit me. We woke up and fought for our lives against raging beasts, followed by hours of rest, recovery, and cleanup. Pain at the loss of a family member and the funeral of a loved one. Excitement and wonder at the new arcane world that was hinted at. All of those emotions felt in the period of a single day really mess with your mind. I had never been the best at dealing with emotions, and it felt like someone was trying to short-circuit my brain with all of the events that followed one after another. Like a child playing with the thermostat, my head cycled from nervousness to fear and panic. Fear and panic morphed into triumph and pride at beating the wave. That fell to tiredness and exhaustion after the adrenaline left my system. Shock and sadness at finding the body, followed by grief and despair at what was to come. The emotion I felt right now wasn't any of those. It wasn't fear, panic, or despair. It also wasn't pride, triumph, or happiness either. It was determination. Sheer determination drowned out all of the others and sat at the forefront of my mind. I couldn't continue to be this weak. I wouldn't allow any other family members to die. I wouldn't let anything else happen that I didn't want to happen. To get that kind of power, I needed to do more. I needed to hunt beasts and level as quickly as I could. The conversation with my father be damned. I wasn't going to sit here and let my family members' lives be dictated by whether or not we were strong enough to beat the wave. I would remove that variable from the equation and get so strong that I would carry them through this if I had to. It doesn't matter if leveling as quickly as possible had potential detriments. No downside in the world could beat the possibility of having to bury more of my family in this foreign world. I couldn't be reckless about this though, or it would be me they were sending off next. I would have to train like there was no tomorrow, taking everything my body would give me, then go back for more. I'd have to pick my battles wisely, as an injury would lead to downtime, and that would result in time I could have used training. My face hardened and my mind was set. There was nothing anyone could do to stop me. I would carry on where others couldn't. I would drag my family to the finish line no matter what the sick and twisted tutorial would throw at me. I had my plan. Now the only thing left to do was rest for a few hours before getting up early to put it into motion. Chapter 14 Training. I woke up so early in the morning to start my training for the day that it felt like I just fell asleep and only got an hour of rest. It was so early that the birds had just begun their bird calls and the sun was barely in the air. If my phone still worked, it would show it being near the ass crack of dawn. No one else in the camp was up yet, and the lack of sound was disturbing. I was never the first one up, so there was usually the sound of conversations or the clinking of pots and pans for cooking, and it was odd to view the camp like this. It put the camp in a new light. The only time it was this quiet was late at night when it was dark outside. Getting up so early in the morning was hard. Getting up so early in the morning without coffee was harder. I made a promise to myself that, if this training went well and if I ended up raking in the points, I would splurge and buy some. There was no better motivator for me right now than coffee and the impending doom that my family faced. So without further delay, I grabbed my gear and readied myself to venture into the forest to start my preparations. After gearing up inside my tent and making sure that I had everything that I would need, I began to make my way out of camp toward the forest. Before I could make it a few steps toward the new gates, I saw Austin exiting his tent with all of his gear equipped and looking like he was ready to face down a monster. We both spotted each other at the same time, and when we did, both of us froze. Neither of us expected that anyone else would be up this early, and it showed when we both just froze like deer in headlights. After staring at each other for a moment, I pointed at the gate to convey we should talk over there to not wake anyone else up from the noise. Austin nodded, and both of us made our way over there. As soon as we were out of earshot, I yelled at him. What are you doing up? And why are you fully geared? Yes, I was being a hypocrite asking what he was doing up when I was also up, but I didn't care about that right now. What am I doing up? Did you think that you were the only one to realize we needed to do more in order to survive? I'm up to go hunting same as you, I'm guessing, he said. Well, I didn't have a response to that. We both had the same idea and both woke up early to do it. I couldn't much blame him for realizing the same thing that I had, and 2 is always better than 1. Well, 2 is better than 1, right? Did you want to go together, or was there something specific that you wanted to do alone? I asked, quickly glossing over the accusatory tone I had previously. If it's the 2 of us, we should be safer, so let's go together. Did you have a plan to go about this? Austin said. Of course, I have a plan. I'm not stupid. I caught Austin looking at the ground with a guilty look. Please tell me you had a plan and weren't just going to frolic in the forest hunting everything in sight. Well, you see, I had a plan, but looking back on it now, it could have been better, he said, trying to pass off his idea as anything other than go hunting. I just shook my head at him before saying, follow me. I actually thought this through, and with the 2 of us, it should go faster. I wasn't going to go off and hunt everything in sight immediately, as that would be foolish. I would begin by making all the tools we would need to then start going off and hunt everything in sight. We began to chop off branches that fit my criteria and find sturdy-looking sticks to increase the amount of javelins we had. My plan was simple. We would venture into the forest with our javelins, carrying along multiple spikes to use as traps for the animals we were hunting. Most of the beasts in the forest were the smaller creatures like rabbits and squirrels, with the occasional deer. Our target was the boars that were roaming around the forest. We would plant the spikes firmly into the ground, propped up by whatever was around, and then attack the boar from a distance using our javelins. After it was running toward us, we would run back to where we planted the spikes. The hope was that it would skewer itself on the spikes we had, but if it was smart enough not to do that, we had a backup plan. Fighting as many boars as we have already, I felt confident in taking them down by myself. I wasn't 100% in winning alone without any injuries, but with Austin here, the second part of my plan wouldn't be necessary. Not being confident in winning without injury, I had to stack the odds in my favor. The spikes were the first part, and the second would be pitfall traps. If the spikes failed to kill it, I would have it run over a pitfall trap I would dig. While it was trying to get out, I would cripple its limbs to decrease its mobility before going in for the kill. I know taking the time to dig the pitfall traps was time that I could use to hunt other creatures, but I felt that it would have been a good use of my time. Getting injured would waste more time than digging the trap, and I planned to work out my body while digging. After telling Austin my plan, he agreed that the second part was unnecessary. With the 2 of us here, we could work together to fight the boar and wouldn't need to waste time digging a pitfall trap. We would take turns attacking the boar, making it split its attention between the 2 of us. It didn't take us long to make our way through the forest and finish the preparations. Finding branches and sticks that worked was the easy part. With the amount of trees available, it was the carving that took the longest time. It took us around half an hour to finish sharpening them down so that they would be lethal and start skulking through the forest to find our prey. This was also when I realized that I had no way to tell what level anything was. There might be something that I overlooked while making the plan, I said sheepishly. And what would that be? Austin said. We have no way to tell what level anything is, I said back. Austin stopped for a second and let out a sigh when he found out I was right. Every time that we fought anything, we had Kyle with us to tell us what level the thing was. Now that we were alone, we found that we would be going in blind. Nothing close to the camp was found to be high level other than the bear. As long as we steer clear of that, then we should be fine, I said. During all the different scouting trips that we've done, one of the main things that was focused on was threats to the camp. Anything with a high level was deemed a threat to watch out for. Most of the rogues did the scouting and were basically forced to take the identify skill to know what level things were. If they didn't, they could stumble onto something that was way higher level than them without knowing it. Also, it was a good idea to get more people with the ability to tell what level something was. During the week that we've been in this tutorial, the forest near the camp has been scouted extensively. Already, we were making our way deeper into the forest to extend our range, and there were discussions of scouting the mountains to the north as well. In the forest, the only things that were found so far were a variety of forest animals all under level 10 other than the bear. Since the animals were mostly solitary and weren't mutated like the bosses during the waves, they were deemed not a threat to the camp and left alone. The bear was a different story. Being level 15 put it over 10 levels above us, and being the apex predator didn't help things. A level 15 rabbit didn't have the same connotations as a level 15 bear. Bears killed humans long before levels came to Earth, and we were taught from a young age not to mess with them. There were some plans in the works of hunting the bear down, but with how busy have been recently, it never came to pass. The bear also just minded its own business in the forest and never came closer to the camp. If it had, we would have worked together to kill it. After some more discussion, both of us agreed that continuing was worth the risk. The highest level boar that was found was level 8, and there were only a few of those this close to the camp. Most of the higher level animals were further out in the forest. Since we most likely wouldn't run into anything too high level, we decided to proceed with the plan. Identify is definitely going to be my next skill. It didn't take us long to find a boar after we stumbled onto the telltale signs of boar activity. Heavy hoof marks in the dirt and dug-up plants that the boars foraged for were easy to spot. We didn't even need a tracking skill, it was so easy to find. It might have been the fact that the boar wasn't trying to hide that made it so easy, but we didn't think about that. After finding it, we backed away to begin the preparations. I figured out that Power Strike could be used with a shovel while we were digging the traps for camp, so while I was digging the hole for the spikes, I could also train my magic skills. The only thing I would have to train later would be agility and perception. Fortitude and vitality training were inevitable in the battles to come. There was no way I was going to make it through the whole day completely unharmed, but I would try to limit the injuries to ones that I could fight through. Getting scratches and scrapes were bound to happen. It was the more serious wounds that I was worried about. It wasn't long before everything was in place and we could begin the fight. Austin and I both had our javelins ready, standing about 100 feet from the boar. The boar had no clue we were there and continued sniffing around the forest floor, oblivious to the two men aiming it. Both of us released at the same time, and both javelins hit their target at around the same time. Mine flew a little faster, but with the distance being so short, there wasn't a lot of time spent in the air. The boar obviously didn't appreciate the two new additions sticking out of it and whirled to find the perpetrators. It charged straight at us after it found us and Austin, and I took off running toward the spikes. Leaves and branches whizzed by as we sprinted toward the spikes, with the occasional branch hitting us in the face. We had to set up the spikes a distance away from the boar, otherwise it would hear us, so there was a decent amount of ground we had to cover while the boar was chasing us. Given the head start we had, it wasn't even close to reaching us before we reached the trap. Both of us slid in between the spikes and turned to taunt the boar to follow. We both threw another javelin at it to make sure that it wouldn't pay attention to what lay ahead of it and be so aggravated that it charged ahead blindly. We tried to camouflage the spikes the best we could with leaves, vines, and other plant life, but it wasn't perfect. Luckily for us, the boar never noticed the danger it was running toward and ran headlong into the spikes. Our plan worked perfectly. The boar incapacitated itself on the spikes and couldn't back away. The only thing left to do was wait for it to bleed out or put it out of its misery. We went with option 2, and Austin thrust his spear deep into its chest, killing it. You have contributed in slaying Highland Boar. Level 5, 10 points earned. It was surprisingly easy. Everything worked out perfectly and our first boar went down without a hitch. We quickly deconstructed the spikes and, with our newfound confidence, searched the forest for our next victim. We found a few more boars that ended up meeting their end, but it was soon time for breakfast and people would wonder where we were. We had to head back before people freaked out that we were missing. After finishing off our 5th boar, we packed up everything and started heading back to camp. None of the boars went down as easily as the first, and we had varying levels of problems for each one. The spike broke during the 2nd boar and we had to face it down with our weapons. Being as experienced as we were fighting boars made it simple at this point, and we ended it without any injuries. The 3rd boar noticed the spikes and avoided them completely, forcing us to face a fully healthy boar without any injuries. It went down much like the 2nd, but took longer. Austin and I also didn't walk away unscathed. The 4th and 5th had a combination of issues. Chapter 15 Hope. It was difficult to weave my way through the camp without advertising the fact I had just come back from battle. But most people were more concerned with the fact breakfast was ready than they were with scrutinizing me and Austin. We made it to Abigail's tent without notice and found that she wasn't there. I should have expected that given she would be coordinating the different tasks the family was going to be assigned today. They usually took a break to eat breakfast, so I didn't feel bad about interrupting her and gave Anna the task of going to get her. Anna jumped to the task and ran toward the middle of camp without hesitation. It was a good thing that she was there because if we had to walk through the middle of camp to retrieve Abigail, someone would have definitely noticed something. It didn't take long for Anna to come back with Abigail in tow, and she still had a few pieces of bacon from her unfinished breakfast. It didn't take her long to notice us, and she immediately frowned when she saw us. She was always too observant. Any time when I was younger and tried to sneak out to a party, it was like something whispered in her ear that I was hiding something and she would come to investigate. It was unfair. It was like she had a sixth sense when I was about to go out. She never told on me though, which was a good thing. She would just say to be careful and call her if I needed a ride. It was comforting to know and was also the reason I came to her now. "What did you two do?" was the first thing out of her mouth. Not "good morning" or "how are you doing," jumping straight to accusations. I didn't hold back from telling her, and as the story progressed her face became more and more angry, and by the end of it she was almost vibrating from anger. "You idiots! Do you know how dangerous that was? What if you got killed or seriously wounded? If an artery was hit, you would bleed out by the time it would take to make it back to camp. Were you even using your head?" She very angrily made her points. I wasn't going to back down though. It was a calculated risk, Abigail. You know that if nothing changes, more people will end up like Derek. I don't want to see that happen, and I'm doing something to prevent it. We were careful and were quite successful, I might add. It doesn't matter if you were successful. It was reckless. Abigail was nearly yelling now. Abby, think this through. Use that giant brain of yours and think about the future. What do you think will happen for the rest of the tutorial? It's only been 11 days and already we lost someone. What do you think will happen in the 80 days to come? Do you think the waves will just stop? I paused to give her time to think before continuing. No. The waves will continue to get stronger and we need to get stronger to beat them. She took a moment to think about what I said and I could see her calming down. The anger leaving. She almost looked defeated when she spoke again. I know, Christopher, but I don't want to lose anyone else. It's not on your shoulders alone to force yourself to get stronger. All of us can work together. I'm one of the only single ones here. I don't have any kids to take care of, and no significant other to come back to. If someone were to do this, it would be me. It was one of the darker thoughts I had last night, but it was true. I didn't have any kids that relied on me, and there was no girlfriend or wife that I would leave behind if the unfortunate happened. In an ideal world, it would be me who would be next. Slap. As soon as I said that, Abigail slapped me in the face. I was so taken aback I didn't even notice her move. With my increased fortitude and her low strength, the slap didn't hurt, but it still surprised me. Don't you dare ever say that again. Just because you don't have any kids doesn't mean no one will miss you. I will miss you and I won't let you go off trying to kill yourself, she said. I'm not trying to kill myself. Everything was planned out and I didn't do anything reckless, I said back before adding. And Austin was there to have my back if anything went wrong. From the look on his face, Austin did not appreciate being dragged into this conversation. That was too bad for him because I was losing and needed some backup who just so happened to be standing behind me. Abigail just shook her head. You two were always up to no good before. It shouldn't surprise me that you are now. At least promise me that you will be careful and not do anything too reckless. Austin and I both promised and she finally agreed to heal us. It didn't take long and after casting a spell on the both of us we were as good as new. All of us walked over for breakfast and acted like nothing happened. There was no point in letting the whole family know. They would try to stop me and I couldn't let that happen. The downside of keeping it a secret from my family was we couldn't bring back the bodies. It wasn't like we were going to run out of food or anything, but some parts were useful. The hide could be cured and turned into extra armor or used for building. The tusks could be made into tools along with the bones. It made me feel like a barbarian when I used them, but it was necessary. That was another thing I caught myself thinking a lot. Necessity. It never dictated my actions more than it did now. I fought because it was necessary, I trained because it was necessary, and I used bone tools because it was necessary. I was scared to think about what I would do in the future because it was necessary. I already knew at some point I would have to take a life, I would have to kill another person, and I didn't know how I would feel about it. It's the little steps that lead to senseless murder that frightened me. It was such a slippery slope to climb. I would have to decide how I wanted to go about it, and that was more useful before I was forced to take a life because it was necessary. Breakfast was the usual affair, but before we could get to work, Granddad stopped us. "Hold on, everybody. There's something that we need to talk about before we start the day," he said. "Now that the wall has been built, we need to decide what to buy next. We still have points left over from the last wave to use, and it's better to use them now rather than later." They either missed the spikes altogether or didn't incapacitate themselves after hitting them. The fourth boar just backed off of the spikes after a superficial wound to its side. That one was angry and fought with a rage that the others had lacked. The fourth was the one we took the most injuries on, as the boar would gladly take a swipe to the leg in order to land a hit on the person it was facing. There wasn't anything life-threatening, it was just unpleasant to deal with. I would have to get Abigail to heal us when we got back. I would have to beg her not to say anything, but she usually had my back about these kinds of things. Neither of us leveled after the hunting trip, but both of us felt good about it. We might not have leveled today, but we would eventually. It was only a matter of time if we were as successful as we had been today. We stashed our extra javelins and the spikes that we made in the forest and washed off in the river before making our way back to camp. Washing off got rid of most of the evidence, but if someone looked over us carefully, it was noticeable. Both of us walked with a limp and looked like we had been up all night with the exhaustion we felt. We both had smiles on our faces though and felt proud about how the day went. Our first day of training could be called a great success. After a quick tally, it was found that we had 1,221 points to decide what to do with. The general consensus was to use it toward more defenses. As we were discussing what would be best, someone asked how much would it cost to upgrade the walls. We had just gotten the walls and no one thought about upgrading them already, but just to get an idea of how much it would cost, someone walked over to the pylon to look. It says, "Upgrade to outpost to unlock more options. The only things we can build are guard towers and some traps. We already know the cost to those." Mark called out over by the pylon. We had all picked over what was available from the pylon and knew that guard towers cost 1,000 each, and the traps had varying costs depending on function. We could build traps ourselves, but after seeing how impressive the wall was, there was the notion that the shop's traps would be significantly better than ours. The only problem with buying the traps was that they were one-time use items. If a wave triggered the traps, we would have to buy them again for the next wave. They weren't permanent structures, and a lot of us thought it wasn't a good idea to rely on those, myself included. With the knowledge that upgrading the pylon unlocked access to be able to upgrade the walls, we began to speculate what else it unlocked access to. Professions were the big thing that everyone was trying to figure out, and most thought that upgrading the pylon was the way to figure it out. The discussion was passionate, to put it mildly. No one wanted to talk about what happened last wave, and most didn't want to voluntarily cause another, but everyone knew we would have to eventually. We were barely a tenth of the way through the tutorial, and we would be forced to upgrade it eventually. No one wanted to be the advocate for it, but we were all thinking it. Eventually, I couldn't take the indecisiveness anymore and said what we were all thinking. We are going to have to upgrade it at some point, and sooner is better than later. I say we upgrade it now. We are all rested and healthy, we have the walls and are prepared for a wave already. It also leaves tomorrow to rest for the wave on day 13. If we put it off and it unlocks something important, we will be kicking ourselves in the future," I said. People nodded along while I was speaking, but I could tell that they had no intention of upgrading it now. It was still too soon and people were scared. It was understandable that they were scared, but it was frustrating. People were too worried to do anything, and that same lack of drive was going to be our downfall. Granddad must have agreed with me but didn't want to be the first to mention it. He advocated hard to upgrade the pylon but eventually had to compromise with the majority of the family. It was decided that we would upgrade the pylon after seeing how effective the walls were this coming wave. If the walls were extremely effective, we would upgrade the pylon then, and if they weren't, we would prepare more before upgrading it. I thought it was stupid to take the wait-and-see approach, but it wasn't my decision to make. A blind man could see that the walls were going to be effective, but people needed assurance, and assurance would take time. It was decided that we would buy a guard tower with our points, and after getting one in each of the 4 directions, we would save up for anything that was unlocked after the upgrade. Buying a guard tower was different than buying the wall in that we had to decide where to place it. The wall automatically built itself at the edge of our claimed territory, but the guard tower needed to be placed. It could go anywhere inside of the walls, but it was most effective as close to the wall as possible, so that's where it was placed. No one wanted to risk the possibility of not being able to buy it while a wave was active, so it was agreed to place it now where the next wave was predicted to come from, the east. We couldn't place it on the wall itself, but just inside of it. It came into being much the same as the wall had and was just as mesmerizing to watch. It was held up by 4 posts on the corners reaching a height of 8 feet, where the wall was just barely past the platform to stand on. It made it so anyone standing on the wall had some cover to hide behind and could easily shoot over it. None of the waves so far had any ranged options, but it was nice to be ready if that proved false. The tower platform was 6 foot square and had enough room for a few people to stand on, but not enough for all the rangers and mages together. It would fit 4 comfortably and 5 if you wanted to push it. People needed room in order to shoot arrows or launch spells, and packing them in any tighter than that would hinder that ability. The platform had a roof extending a couple of feet past the platform that would keep the rain off anyone standing in it and looked sturdy enough to defend against any flying monster that would attack. It had the same enchantments as the wall running along its surface and felt just as sturdy. While we were going over the wall we had just built, in another place there was an attendant that was nervously pacing back and forth before a massive ornate double door. So random Flameborn's POV. I had only been the attendant to my patron for less than a millennium, and already I feared him greatly. My patron hated when things weren't as they should be, and he hated being questioned even more. Why does he make me do this in person? It would be 1,000 times easier if I could just send it over magically like I did with everything else, but this was special. No magic communication and no telepathy over great distances either. My patron demanded an in-person briefing and wouldn't be swayed from his decision. Calm down, I told myself. I had already gone over everything hundreds of times and knew the information by heart. Any question he could ask I knew the answer to. With one final sweep with my spiritual sense to make sure everything was in order and my uniform was without wrinkles, I walked into his office. Heat was the first thing that hit me, but by now I had long gotten used to it. At first, it was uncomfortable to walk through flames that could harm even me, but over time I got used to it. The last person to request to go over the flames was promptly burnt to death a half-second later. That attendant was used as an example to not ask questions, which was what I was about to go do. It didn't take long to make my way through the heat and flames and reach the heart of my patron's domain where he waited seated upon his throne. His seat of power glowed to my spiritual sense with how powerful it was. I knelt at the foot of his throne and waited until I was acknowledged. Speaking out of turn was another story that didn't have a nice ending. This not being my first time here made the wait more bearable, but it was still unpleasant. It was right when I started to sweat that I was finally given acknowledgement and permission to speak. I went through my report swiftly and without any errors, and the only response was a slight nod of his head. It was normally now that I would turn and leave, but I stayed where I was with my head down. "Do you have something else to report?" The words sounded so normal, but one look was enough to know to tread carefully with what I was about to say. "A question, sir, if I may?" I was being as respectful as possible and could only hope that I wouldn't end up dead. "What is it?" That was good news. If he was in a bad mood, I would already be ash. "Everything is already set up for the next wave and everything is prepared, but I still don't understand the reason behind lowering the difficulty. I plead with you to enlighten me," I said. This was the first time I was in charge of an integration tutorial, and my patron had specific instructions laid out for what was to happen. It was difficult to run something that I didn't understand, and that prompted me to ask my question. These humans were nothing special, and their world didn't even have any essence to begin with. They had to all start as lowly H ranks and would never amount to anything before dying so quickly. Only a limited few reached divinity in each integration, and the odds of one coming from some backwater planet with no essence and the population starting in the H rank was minuscule to say the least. Statistically insignificant was more accurate. It was another reason that prompted my question. This is not the first time I've done this, and through trial and error, this had proved to be the best so far. It's no fun if it gets too difficult too fast. It's the gradual loss of hope that's most satisfying. He said with a grim smile on his face. Tell me, how many groups have received a casualty so far? I knew the numbers by heart and answered him immediately. 92%, sir. And the most deaths in a single group? He asked. 7, sir. I replied. Now that they have realized that this isn't a game and the consequences are quite real, they will put in more effort. They will fight tooth and nail to survive and do everything in their power to get stronger. If we kept increasing the difficulty, it wouldn't be as fun to watch. They would continuously lose people until it got too hard and a wave would wipe them out. There would only be despair and people would give up. He said, that is not the purpose of what I am doing. Now that they know this is serious, I want to watch them struggle, even thrive in some cases. It makes it all the more fun to take it away later. It's not being faced with the sudden realization that you are going to die that makes this so fun. It's making them realize it and that there's nothing they can do about it. They might think they can fight their way through this, and some might hold out hope till the end, and those are the people to watch. It makes it so much better watching them fall. As he was going through his speech, it shifted from answering my question to him mostly talking to himself. By the end, there was a wicked look in his eye that sent shivers down my spine. I feel sorry for those poor souls. They were insects, but it was always better to receive a swift end compared to the performance that they were forced into. Chapter 16 Gains. After the novelty of the new guard tower wore off, all of us continued with the rest of the day. There were endless things to do and not enough time in the day to do them. The most labor-intensive task was that we had to dig a moat around the wall and fill it with spikes. Is it still called a moat if it doesn't have water? If it's not a moat, then it was a ditch around the wall. Or would trench be better? It didn't matter. We were digging. I took every chance I could to practice my magical skills, and every time I had enough mana, I used Power Strike. I also practiced my mana skills the whole time to try and get better at manipulating it. Digging itself was its own workout and left me exhausted after it was over. My muscles felt like jelly, and a strong wind could probably knock me over. When it came time to do our daily mock fighting, I could barely swing my axe with how hard I spent the day digging. Still, I pushed through and powered on. Austin and I paired up to be partners, and we held nothing back. Usually, during this time I didn't think much of it, I just went through the motions and did what I was told. Now, I was giving it the importance it was due. We weren't people playing at warriors anymore. Austin and I were truly trying to fight each other. I used everything I had learned so far to beat him, and he did the same. We were both tired from waking up early and spending the day hunting and working, but both gave it our all again during the fight. It wasn't a mock fight anymore, it was a spar. It was the most intense fight I had been in so far, and it made me excited to find out how much better I was from when we first got dropped here. I used everything at my disposal and all the tricks I had picked up during the wave, and nothing worked. Austin had the longer reach with his spear, so I had to try and close the distance if I wanted to win. If I stayed back and let him dictate the fight, he would slowly wear me down before finishing me off. Fighting a person was different than fighting an animal, and it showed in the creativity of attacks. Animals relied on instincts and the natural weapons they've been using all their life. Humans relied on weapons. Since ancient times, humans created weapons for fighting, and throughout history, we have improved on them, building on the previous versions, and that is what led us to the top of the food chain. We didn't have claws on our hands, and we didn't have sharp teeth used to bite with, nor did we have venom to kill things with. We relied on ingenuity and sheer endurance. With all the fighting that I'd done so far, I could use my weapons reliably well, but that was also true for Austin. We were both around the same level in experience, and we were both level 5 with similar stats. We weren't trying to kill each other, so we stuck to using only defensive skills, and since both of us had the same one, it was even there too. Every time I tried to close in and get inside the range of his spear, he would ward me off, forcing me to retreat. Just sprinting at him wasn't going to work, and I needed to think of a better way to close in. Austin was using his spear to great advantage and I was losing. When I would close in, he would back up while thrusting his spear at my head, forcing me to block with my shield. He found out quickly what attacks worked best, and that was the winner so far. Forcing me to block my face with my shield covered my vision, and I would lose sight of him, which he would then use to either reposition or attack the unshielded portions of my body. It was frustrating to say the least. I knew it was coming but could do nothing to stop it. It was a reflex ingrained in my core. It's like when something comes flying at your head, your reflexes make you duck and raise your hands to block. It was a flinch that I couldn't get rid of. I tried to work through it and suppress the urge to flinch, but it was difficult. It was going against 24 years of habit, and I wouldn't be able to change it in a week. While suppressing the urge to block with my shield, I switched to blocking with my axe. It was harder to block, but it didn't get in the way of my vision as much, and that's what I needed. Both of us were constantly shifting around each other and trying to find an opening to attack. I was panting from exhaustion and couldn't keep this up much longer. This fight felt more physically intense than the hours spent digging, even though it was a fraction of the time. In one last-ditch effort to win, I did something Austin didn't expect. I threw my axe. Using the same reflex that he was exploiting this whole time, I turned the tables and used it on him. When something comes flying at you, the immediate response is to try and block it from hitting you, and that is what I was counting on. If he was using his hands to block the axe, he wasn't using them to ward me off from charging him. I didn't throw it very hard, and it wasn't empowered with a skill, so I felt confident it wouldn't hurt him, but he didn't know that. As soon as I threw it, I charged at him with my shield up. I was either going to win or lose depending on if he flinched at the axe. I saw the split second where he had to decide between blocking the axe and me before choosing the axe. He picked wrongly, and I was going to win. I put everything into my charge and was determined to knock him down with a shield bash to end the fight. With my mind confident in my victory, I lunged the final distance at him. Before I could realize what happened, my legs went out from under me and I flipped in the air before landing hard on my back. I didn't have a second to come to grips with what happened before there was a spear in my face. I win, Austin huffed out, panting himself from the fight. It took me a second, and when I realized what he did, I wanted to groan. After I obstructed my own vision with my charge, he ducked and took my legs out from under me. With the built-up momentum, I continued on flipping over him before landing on my back, none the wiser to what happened. I got arrogant, and it had cost me. I thought my victory was so assured that I blinded myself to other possibilities. That was a lesson I wouldn't be forgetting anytime soon. Good fight, was the only thing I could say with how out of breath I was. Austin sat down to join me on the ground, and we both tried to recover our breathing while everyone else sparred. Took a few minutes, but we both got back up and went again. It wasn't as intense, but we both were trying to get better, and it was a great way to train. After the hour was up, we had dinner, and the rest of the night was free time to do whatever we wanted. Most took this time to play with the kids or do different crafts that were needed. I was terrible at drying the hides of the beasts and also wasn't the best butcher, so that was left to the people that wanted to do that. I spent most of my time putting together different tools from the bones and various body parts that we had lying around the camp. The tusks from the boars were tough and could be sharpened into axes that we used for trimming wood that had already been cut down. The tusks weren't large enough for a full woodcutting axe, but they were suitable for the detail work. I also made the shovels that we used to dig, and the picks used to break up the tough spots of dirt and rock. The picks used something that had just been lying around this whole time since the beginning, the rabbit horns. They were perfect for that kind of use and worked well when attached to a handle. The only thing wrong with them is you had to be careful not to break them by swinging too hard. We had extra horns to repair them, but if we weren't careful we would soon run out. Anything that we couldn't make we bought from the store. Now that we weren't poor in points, we spent them more judiciously on things that were needed. More cooking utensils, a water barrel so we didn't have to walk to the river, better quality of life things to make camping easier. Some used personal points for snacks and sweets, but I never indulged in those. There was only one luxury I was saving my points for, and I wouldn't be swayed by chocolate. As soon as dusk rolled around, I was dead on my feet and went to bed early. My body ached all over and I felt like I couldn't get up even if I tried. It was a good first day of training and I was looking forward to seeing the results tomorrow morning. As soon as I woke up in the morning, I checked my notifications to see how well I did and was shocked at the results. I got a stat increase in almost every stat. The only ones left out were perception, fortitude, and intelligence. 6 stats got an increase and some got more than one. Stats increased from training. Strength 21-23, Agility 9-10, Endurance 15-17, Vitality 16-17, Wisdom 9-10, Acumen 7-8. Looking over my stats made me elated. The training was better than anything I had done so far and resulted in a much bigger gain than I thought it would. I also noticed that I didn't use my free point from reaching level 5 and put it into agility to bring it up again. I still didn't know if there was an issue if one stat got higher than the other, but I noticed while fighting Austin yesterday that he was faster than me and it was hard to keep up with him. Hopefully, this would even the odds between us and I would do better when we fought again today. With renewed vigor, I rolled out of bed and put on my gear to go hunting again this morning. I met Austin outside the gates and walked to where we stashed our gear the previous day before going out into the forest to find our prey. It was about halfway into our allotted hunting time that Austin gained a level. He reached level 6 and was able to gain another skill. We both had the same plans for our next skill and already decided that it was going to be identify. It was just too useful not to get and would make it that much easier to find things that we could kill. We weren't going to run out of anything to hunt in the next few days, but we would eventually, and we would need a way to tell how dangerous something was before we attacked it. We talked about only one of us grabbing the skill and leaving the other to get something else, but after some thorough discussion, we decided that both getting it was the best option. If one of us got injured and wasn't able to fight, the other would have to carry on without them, and if they didn't have the skill they would run into the same problem we were having now. Not long after Austin leveled, I hit level 6 as well. I placed my free point into agility again and picked identify as my next skill. It was a little disappointing to have to use a class skill on it instead of buying it when I had enough points, but it would take too long to be able to afford it. After that, the day went much the same as the previous had, with work being draining and sparring after. Agility training after that, then some time spent making tools. All capped off with the bedtime of a senior citizen. I felt a bit of accomplishment while I was lying in bed and couldn't help looking at my status screen. My body was drained and my brain hurt from the magic exercises, but that meant I was doing something right. I fell asleep with the window open and wished I would wake up to the same results. Name: Christopher Zelensky. Race: human. Age: class: warrior, level 6. Profession: none. Faction: Zelensky family. Temporary. Strength 25, Agility 12, Perception 10, Fortitude 15, Endurance 18, Vitality 18, Intelligence 8, Wisdom 10, Acumen 8, Free points 0, Laws none. Skills: Power Strike, Fortified Body, Throwing Weapon Proficiency, Beginner, Identify, Coins 0, Points 346. Chapter 17: Superior Defenses. Waking up, I pulled up the training notification to check the results from yesterday. Increase from training: Strength 25-26, Endurance 18-19, Vitality 18-19, Wisdom 10-11, Intelligence 8-9. It was less impressive than yesterday, but it was still a huge increase compared to before. I even got my first increase in intelligence. Now the only stat that I hadn't increased so far was perception. I felt once I could sense mana better and the different mana types, that's when I'd get the increase in perception. I still couldn't differentiate between the different mana types, but Rachel said that they were there and the mana used in Firebolt and Icebolt were strikingly different. It made sense since the elements were complete opposites, but I still couldn't tell the difference between them with my mana senses. They both felt like magic to me. Mana had this fleetingness to it that made it hard for me to see it. The Ice Bolt was easier to sense than the Fire Bolt, but they were both difficult. It was much easier to tell visually from the effects mana had than to sense the mana directly. I'd been working on it trying to get better, but the main problem was I didn't understand it. It was like walking up to a random car, opening the hood, and being quizzed on what each part did when you were unfamiliar with it. If someone could teach me what it actually was, it would make it so much easier. I didn't do well learning from the feelings others got when sensing it, and having them describe it in more detail was unhelpful. I could sense mana the best when I was getting hit with it from our mock fights where a mana bolt would strike my body. After the mages got better at controlling their skills and weakening them, they were allowed to use them during the training time. They still hurt to get hit with, but they did little more than aggravate. It was way more painful to get hit with a weapon blunted with wood than the weak magic bolts. Still, I was determined to get better at it. There was no way that magic was introduced to Earth and I was not going to learn it. I may not have picked the mage class, but that didn't mean I wouldn't be able to fling fireballs from my hand. It would just take longer and be more work. I closed my notification and rolled out of bed to get ready for breakfast that I could already hear being prepared. It was day 13 and time for the 5th wave to come. Having a wave coming today, Austin and I decided to take the day off to be at 100% for the battle. It wouldn't be good to be tired and mana drained going into the fight, especially after the last wave. Everyone was nervous and all had different severities of grim faces during breakfast, but seeing the wall helped with that. If we still had to rely on our makeshift defenses, there would be a lot more worry about today than there was. The wall was sturdy and we trusted it to do its job. Plans were drawn up on how to fight the wave and thrown out just as quickly, and it took a lot of discussion before one was settled on. Having the wall, people assumed we would just hunker down behind it while the rangers or mages in the guard tower killed everything. I and many others were against that idea for different reasons. I didn't like the idea because I wouldn't be able to kill anything to level up. Others didn't like it because it involved trusting the wall to hold while it took forever to kill everything. It might be sturdy enough to stop the boar's charge from last time, but how well would it hold up to sustain damage while it took time to kill everything? What if the wave was bears this time and they had free rein to claw through the wall? What if it was something that could climb the wall given enough time? We tested to make sure that wasn't possible, but what did we know? There could be a magic beast capable of doing it anyway, and we couldn't rule that possibility out. The trench was not even close to finish circling around camp. But we started at the east gate for this specific reason. There was about a 20-foot-long section that was completed, spikes and all, that was prepared for today, and we were confident in what we built. It wasn't like the spike wall that could be broken. The only way through it was to jump over it or be tough enough to ignore the spikes and climb out. Nothing we had seen so far would be able to fall in and be capable of climbing out without grave wounds, but jumping it was a different story. It was wide enough that we ourselves had a hard time doing it, but that said nothing of the variety of animals that possibly could. We built the trench 10 feet out from the wall to leave room between the two for this specific reason. The plan was to fill it with traps so anything that jumped the trench would trigger them, but we hadn't gotten that far yet. But the distance between the trench and the wall was a perfect place to put melee warriors who wanted to fight. Depending on which direction you were facing, your right flank was covered by the trench and your left by the wall, or vice versa if you were facing the other direction. We would have people facing both directions, so your back would be covered, and the only thing you had to focus on was what was in front of you. It was a perfect place to fight, and the gap only being 10 feet, it was a natural choke point that limited the amount of beasts that could attack you at once. Austin and I were both advocates of putting warriors out there to gain experience, and we argued hard to be able to do it. Austin was under the impression that no one else's opinion mattered and basically told everyone, "Who are you to stop me?" That went over about as predictably as it could. Eventually, Granddad made the executive decision that it was their choice and they could do it if they wanted to, only if they agreed to certain conditions. The conditions were that if the wave had anything that could charge through you, it wouldn't be allowed, and if we were ordered to come back, we had to no questions asked. It was a good condition and we all agreed to it. If it was another wave of boars, they would just charge through us, and instead of the gap being a natural choke point, it would turn into a runway the boars used to trample us. The plan already was to start in front of the wall and keep the gate open in the beginning, so that didn't change matters, it only changed the fact we had to keep them open. We had leftover defenses to put in the opening we could use, but that would hinder the ability to close the gate. So not only did we have to have enough volunteers to actually fight in front of the wall, there had to be people to hold the gate so nothing got through. At first, there weren't enough people who wanted to do it, but we managed to convince a few who were on the fence about it, so we had enough. Austin and I were both for it and wanted to fight in the gap, along with my Uncle Mark and Scott. 2 on each side was enough for 5 feet of movement, and adding a third would make it cramped, so there was enough willing to fight. Jonathan and my dad both were hesitant to volunteer, but I convinced them to participate in holding the gate. It wouldn't be as hard as fighting in the gap, and with their shields it would make it easy to block anything from getting through. Jonathan didn't want to risk being in any danger because he had to take care of his kids, but I convinced him that contributing to more kills would make him stronger and increase his ability to protect them. After Jonathan agreed, my dad followed suit, and with a few extra people we had our gate blockers. The gate being able to close quickly was an issue. If someone got injured or we got pushed back, we would need to enter the gate quickly and be able to close it. It helped that the gate opened outward, but we would need to hold the monsters off long enough to get everyone through before closing it. We hadn't practiced a fighting retreat, but I was certain we would be rehearsing that before the next wave. Convincing everyone took time, but we managed it with a few hours to spare, and the plan was finalized. We would start in front of the wall and launch a few volleys of javelins before everyone would retreat behind the wall except for the people who volunteered to fight. The rangers would be up in the guard tower raining down arrows the whole time while the mages rotated through people to fire off their spells. To keep the mages from running out of mana, they would rotate who was in the tower with the rangers so everyone participated and so that they could contribute their skills. They were told to save at least half of their mana for the boss so Rachel could do the same as last time and combine their skills to blow it up. Noon arrived and everyone was set and ready for the wave to come. The notification chimed as usual, and after a minute the wave started. Kyle was confused at first but eventually yelled out what the wave was, and all of us were a bit confused when we heard. It was a mixture of every wave we had faced so far. There were rabbits, squirrels, deer, and a few boars. There wasn't even a boss monster, but the sheer number of them made up for that deficit. After getting the Identify skill, I could see the monster's levels, the same as Kyle, but his was better. Not only did it do what Identify did, but it also increased his vision. He could identify things from much further out than the people with just Identify. I was kind of jealous about it. The levels were what we expected, being levels 5 and 6, but the numbers were not. There were double the previous wave of boars, and the mixture was all different sizes. As they took the time to charge toward us, they started to separate based on speed. The deer were the fastest and would reach us first, followed by the rabbits and squirrels, and then the handful of boars would be last. It made our volleys less effective, but it was easier to handle than them hitting all at once. The deer were easiest to hit with the javelins, and we couldn't delay long enough to use them on the boars. So the deer were our targets. They went down much the same as they had previously, and after everyone shuffled through the gates, Austin and I were left to face down our side of the gap alone. Arrows whizzed by overhead and magic bolts exploded occasionally, but with only 4 ranged attackers it didn't do much. Austin had the side closest to the wall, and I was closer to the trench, and both of us had fought enough together not to get in each other's way. The same for the 2 brothers on the other side. I used my shield to stop the leading deer, and before I knew it, we were fighting off the horde. I was hacking and slashing every chance I got and pushed the occasional deer into the trench with my shield. A few got past me, but I trusted the people holding the gate to finish them off. Nothing got past me uninjured, and it wouldn't be hard to complete the kill. The deer fell quickly, and soon it was the wall of rodents that I had to chop through. My fortitude had increased so much that the squirrels didn't do any damage, and the rabbits could only injure me if they hit somewhere unarmored. Without the risk of injury, I fought way more aggressively, and the mound of bodies around me could prove it. I stomped them into the ground, bisected them with my empowered axe, crushed them with my shield, and did it all again. It was a fight, a brutal display of carnage, and it was glorious. It was fun. It was a test of my skill like none other. Me versus the mass of bodies, a battle of who was better, and I wouldn't lose. I needed to get stronger, and these monsters were my path to strength. Everyone I killed was experience toward my next level. Every chime signifying a kill was one closer to my next skill. It passed in a blur, and soon the only ones left were the boars. We had made an agreement to retreat when told, and I was severely tempted to ignore it when I heard Granddad's shout. But ultimately, I didn't want to lose the opportunity to do this next wave, so I followed Austin through the gates. Both of us were covered in blood and out of breath, but with smiles on our faces. Fighting like that gave me such a rush, and it felt better than any drug, even though I had never done them. I sat down to catch my breath and watched them slam the gate closed before sliding the brace in place. I couldn't see what was on the other side, but the sounds of battle didn't last long, and the thuds colliding with the wall petered out after a few minutes. The boars, having no way to get to the archers, made it like shooting fish in a barrel. As soon as the last fell, the notifications rolled in. You have contributed in slaying white-tailed deer, Level 5. 25 points earned. You have contributed in slaying white-tailed deer. Level 5. 18 points earned. You have contributed in slaying forest squirrel. Level 5. 25 points earned. You have contributed in slaying forest squirrel. Level 6. 30 points earned. You have contributed in slaying horned rabbit. Level 5. 16 points earned. You have contributed in slaying horned rabbit. Level 6. 22 points earned. You have successfully defended your claim. Extra experience awarded. 250 points to all who participated. Congratulations. You have leveled up. The list was longer than any I had received so far, and there were more than 30 monsters I contributed in slaying. Less than half I slayed single-handedly, and the points made it easy to tell which. I didn't expect to get a level up so soon after getting one yesterday, but the brutal fight made it easy to get another. It was with great satisfaction that I looked over the notifications that it didn't even register that Abigail was healing me. I was just glad that I made a difference. I didn't hide behind the walls the whole time. I fought and would continue to fight, and it made me excited. I put my free point from the level up into fortitude to bring it up to 17. It was lagging behind my other stats, and I aimed to fix that. Some people were still confused that this wave went so smoothly, but I didn't care. It made me stronger, and that's all that mattered. Chapter 18. Pylon Upgrade. Totaling the points showed that from this wave alone I earned 642 points. That was more than the total amount of points I had earned in the tutorial so far. It effectively doubled the amount of points I earned, and all it took was an hour of fighting. The whole group made an astounding amount, over 10,000 combined. The distribution wasn't as even and spread out as it usually was during a wave, and I made more than double the amount than some people. The people who hid behind the wall and only participated with a few javelin throws only earned the points for the wave completion and a portion of 1 or 2 monsters depending on how many they hit. It bothered me a little that I fought on the front lines at the risk of injury, while they did practically nothing, and walked away with 260 points while I got just over double that. It was good for the group that they got points, but I felt like they weren't earned. I wasn't going to say anything about it though, but I still thought it. With the 50-50 split that was agreed upon, we had over 5,000 points to figure out what to do with. The first order of business was to build guard towers at the 3 other gates, and that took 3,000 points right there, and a few minutes later 3 new guard towers popped into existence. Now we had to decide on what to use the rest of them on. We should have people buy a skill with the extra. Someone said before that was quickly shot down. 1 or 2 people getting a skill wasn't going to be very useful during the waves. We should double up on the guard towers so we can fit more people up there. That was a decent idea, but there was some uncertainty behind it. We didn't know how much the wall upgrade would cost and how long it would take to save up for it. Also, we didn't know if upgrading the wall would make it wider and have a place to stand on, making the guard towers obsolete. We should save them and see what the pylon upgrade unlocks. That was the idea I got behind. 1, it forced the issue of upgrading the pylon, and 2, it saved some points for anything good that was unlocked. With the momentum of the conversation going that way anyway, I tried to force the issue. We should upgrade the pylon now. We are all already prepared for a wave, and the defenses didn't even get scratched. It won't take us long to clear the bodies and retrieve the arrows and javelins. If we do it today, we will still have 2 days of rest before the next one. I said. I didn't want the issue to be pushed off again and wished to use the momentum from the easy wave. We just had to get people to agree. Originally, we were going to wait and upgrade it tomorrow after seeing if there were any modifications we would have had to make after seeing how the wall did. But those were moot now. The wall effectively removed any chance of harm and only risked people who chose to fight of their own volition. Took some arguing and convincing, but people came around. I thought it was mostly the hope of getting a profession rather than seeing what new things would be unlocked in the shop. Kyle and a few of the other teens went on and on about different fantasy professions that they wanted to get and filled people's heads with their own fantasies. They talked of magical enchanters that could make weapons powerful enough to kill bosses single-handedly, and builders who could build a house in a couple of hours flat. Master blacksmiths who could make a sword that could pierce any monster. The source material they were pulling this from was flimsy, but I couldn't naysay it when I could pull up a status screen that showed my stats. Our world had turned into manga and fiction already, Who was I to say they were wrong? The biggest hit with most people was an alchemist who could make the healing potions that were so expensive in the store. Mostly, people just wanted an avenue to get stronger that didn't rely on danger, and professions seemed like it would. I couldn't blame them, and based on the fantasy stories I've read, crafters would be necessary. It took another hour or two to move all the bodies and pick up all the projectiles from the battlefield, but we were once again ready to face another wave. The hardest part was getting the bodies out of the trench, and that required multiple people and a lot of rope. We all stood ready, and Granddad walked over and put his hand on the pylon. He stood there for a second staring off into space, where only he could see the screen, before a notification chimed. Upgrade to outpost underway. Prove you are worthy. Well, that's delightful. How were we supposed to prove we were worthy? It didn't spawn a hammer we had to pick up, and there didn't seem to be anything else happening. There was nothing other than that, no instructions or tasks, not even a quest objective to go do. We stood around confused until someone up in the guard tower shouted in alarm. It was another wave. We figured it might be like that since claiming the pylon spawned one. Why should upgrading one be any different? It was annoying that everything came down to being assaulted by a mass of bodies, but I figured there had to be a reason for that. I'll take 100 of the same level monsters over one powerful monster any day. The monsters were coming from a different direction than the previous wave, and it seemed to be random. It didn't follow the clockwise pattern this time, and the assault was coming from the west. The only part of the moat that we had dug out was in the east, so there wasn't anything separating the wall from the charging animals. We all shifted and rushed out the western gate to get ready, waiting for Kyle to tell us what we were up against. Kyle, what's taking so long? Mark was the first to break and ask Kyle what was going on. I spared a glance toward the person in question myself and saw that his mouth hung open and he had an incredulous look on his face. Hal, next to him in the tower, knocked him on the head, which brought him back to normal. Once he noticed all of us looking at him, his face flushed red and he stammered, Sorry. I just couldn't believe it. It says that they are level 4 and 5 goblins. Goblins? Like the green little disgusting creatures in fantasy games? Were we really about to face down a horde of goblins? I could see now why Kyle was out of sorts. It was every gamer kid's dream. Goblins were the starter mob in almost every fantasy game, and they symbolized the start of a fantasy journey. Everyone knew what they were, and if you didn't, you were living under a rock. A stray thought entered my brain about hiding the women, but there was no way goblins were really like that. It's time to slay some goblins. We did what we usually did, wore them down from a distance before going behind the walls. The long-range bombardment was extremely effective and wiped out over half of the charging goblins. It seemed like they weren't particularly strong and fell quickly when hit with anything. It was kind of disappointing. At this rate, I wouldn't get to fight anything. They were lower level than me, so it wouldn't give me as much experience, but I still wanted to fight them. It only took a few moments and all the goblins were either dead or dying. Some we would have to go finish off in the field, but most had already breathed their last. It seemed like we could have upgraded the pylon much earlier. This was on the same level of difficulty as the rabbits and squirrels. Sure, the goblins could do some damage if they got close, but they were so weak they never made it. The one who made it the furthest was the goblin chief, but I think that was because of his higher level rather than a racial thing. I got some points for the kills and on the success of upgrading the pylon, but it was nothing compared to a few hours ago. I got a few points for a kill and 100 for the upgrade. It was a sixth of what I got earlier. It was supremely disappointing. I felt like I didn't even progress toward the next level at all. We could have finished off that wave a week ago. It was so easy. We walked the battlefield to clean up and threw all the bodies in the forest. There was no way we were eating goblin. They also didn't have any useful body parts, and I'm not sure how I would feel about using them. They weren't human and frankly, not even close, but they were humanoid-ish. There was some intelligence in them, and they were bipedal like us, and that is where the similarities ended though. It was close enough to make it weird. After the cleanup, we all rushed to see what was unlocked and found a building where the pylon had once been. The pylon was in the middle of our camp, and there was nothing surrounding it, so we could access it from all sides. But now there was a wooden building sitting there. It looked much like the guard towers and the walls and seemed to be made from the same wood. I wasn't near it when it was built, so I couldn't tell if it had the same engravings on it the others had. It looked like a fancy log cabin and extended over 20 feet in the air. It was the same length on both sides and had a single front door in the middle of the wall. It was made fully of wood, the walls were wood, the door was wood, and the roof was sloped and made of wooden shingles. One stray ember and this place is done for. It was most likely fireproof, but I still couldn't help but think it. All of us were curious about the new creation and ventured into it to see what was new. The door creaked open and we filed through the doorway to find the pylon right where it always was, in the middle of the room. It was the first thing that caught the eye since it was the only thing in the room. There was a staircase on the right-hand wall leading to what was presumably the second floor, but other than that the room was empty save for the pylon in the middle of it. Walking up to the second floor showed more of the same except the ceiling was pitched to match the roof instead of flat like on the first floor. It was anticlimactic to have a building show up out of nowhere and have nothing in it. With nothing to see in the building, we all checked on the pylon to see what was new, and oh boy was there new stuff. The walls were unlocked to be upgraded and the guard towers could be as well. More traps were available for purchase along with better armor and weapons. The skill list was longer and even had different options for purchase. There were skill shards for single use where only one person could learn it before the shard crumbled, and there was a skill stone where 10 people could use it before it broke. It was way more expensive, but it was cheaper per skill than buying 10 skill shards. Those weren't even the most important changes. There was a brand new tab added to the top of the shop labeled Information. In the tab, it listed all kinds of things and most had the Introduction to label attached to them. It was like enrolling in college classes where you could purchase an information guide on various subjects. The list went on and there was Introduction to Forging, Introduction to Carpentry, Introduction to Leatherworking, and more. What drew the most attention was the top of the list that said, Introduction to the Multiverse. That sparked interest like none of the others did. We would finally be getting some answers. Chapter 19, Unexpected. While we were all gushing about all the new and shiny additions to the store that we could now buy, we had yet to notice the price tags that came along with said new things. We were all picking through different pages, seeing what was new, and checking the price came only later. What the hell? I heard someone say. We all looked around to find the reason for alarm but found nothing. What's with the shouting? There's nothing around. Granddad said. Look how expensive everything is. Mark elaborated. After being prompted to, we all looked at the associated price tags of the new additions and couldn't help but gasp. They were expensive. The wall was the most expensive purchase we had made so far, and that was 5,000 points, and that would be tied for the cheapest option on this new list. The introductions to all the different professions had different levels of pricing, and the cheapest was 5,000. The most expensive was closer to 10,000, and those were the more magically inclined professions like alchemist and enchanter. We still didn't even know if the information packets even gave you the profession. It was assumed that it would, but we had no confirmation. It felt like that information would be included in the introduction to the multiverse information packet, but that was the most expensive. It was an egregious 20,000 points. It felt like a rip-off to cost so much just for information and like it was deliberate. It dangled answers in front of our faces but locked them behind a huge paywall that we couldn't afford. Some game devs were probably jealous of how ruthless it was. We only had just over 4,000 points to spend after the pitiful upgrade wave, and that couldn't buy anything in the information section, and we wouldn't be able to get much for a while. After the next wave, we would be able to buy 2 of the 5,000 point ones, but then there was the choice of which. It would be a waste for everyone to get the same profession, and we would need to diversify, but that meant we needed to purchase more profession manuals, and that meant points spent on that instead of defenses. Since we were so close to being able to afford one, we decided to all contribute some extra points to see what we were dealing with. The only problem now was to decide on which. Some were immediately eliminated based on price like enchanter, and others based on function like farmer and gardener. They were probably fine professions, they just weren't helpful now. An argument was made to splurge and buy alchemist at 10,000 points, but that would take too many points from everyone. It would take 200 points a person in addition to the points we had saved up to buy that one, and some people didn't have that many points to spare. I had around 700 points personally and wasn't keen on giving up so many of them for a profession I wasn't even going to use. I was saving my points to buy a new skill and felt like a waste to use them now when we would have enough points in a few days after the next wave. I had already given my missing profession slot a lot of thought and knew that alchemist wasn't going to be my choice. I could do it if I had to, but something else would be better. The one I really wanted was enchanter, but I didn't know if the cost would be justified to purchase it. Plus, enchanting seemed like an expensive endeavor that wouldn't be worth it during the tutorial. If it cost an arm and a leg to enchant a sword which only increased its effectiveness marginally, it wasn't worth it. We wouldn't know how effective it would be until we bought it and someone became an enchanter, but to get there a lot of points needed to be spent already. Anyway, the one we decided on was carpenter. Leatherworker was close, but carpenter beat it. Our armor was in desperate need of repair, but the need for houses was greater. We were still living in tents, and the only structure in our camp just materialized less than an hour ago. Plus, we thought it would help with making the spikes and traps we were making. I thought it was kind of weird that certain things were classes and not professions. Being a nurse was a profession before, and now being a healer is a class, while making traps seems like it should be a profession, but it was a class. Everyone wanted to see what this new information contained, and were all on the edge of our seats as we watched the points cross the threshold and a book materialized into reality. For some reason I was disappointed, but it made sense to be a book. I didn't know what else I was thinking it would be, but it felt anticlimactic to just be a book. Opening it revealed information on how to get the carpenter profession along with different things that the profession could do. It was a primer and a step-by-step process on how to become a carpenter. It was exactly the information that we needed, and the mystery of getting a profession was revealed. It revealed different things a carpenter could do and some of the skills that they would have eventually, and everyone got excited. They had a skill that could cause wooded joints to merge seamlessly along with a ton of different skills used in building. They could sense the wood and strengthen it with skills to make it stronger and more resistant to attack. They could also make it more resistant to the weather and so that water wouldn't be able to get it. Suffice it to say that it was a great purchase. I still had no interest in becoming a carpenter, but others did, and a few were rereading through the steps to start. Scott was the most familiar with it since he built houses for a living and was the first one to give it a go. It involved building something from scratch utilizing specific ways of mana manipulation that you had to do. The book detailed the various techniques and pointed out that making different things and using different techniques results in different professions, and to be careful and adhere to what was written to get the desired profession. The book said that failure to stick to what was written could result in receiving the builder profession or the woodworking profession instead of the carpenter profession if you weren't careful, or other classes depending on what you did. It didn't come out and say that those professions were bad, just that they were an undesirable outcome if you were attempting to become a carpenter. It went into some detail about why that was, but wasn't too deep. All it said was those professions focused on different things and would excel at something different. Woodworkers could still do carpentry work, but that wasn't where they excelled, and the same went for builder. It said in the book that it could take a while, and since we were learning from a book instead of someone with the profession, it would take longer. With nothing else to do but watch Scott and a couple of others work through the different techniques, I looked at Austin and motioned with my head toward the forest. He caught my motion and agreed. It was still early afternoon and wouldn't be dark for a few more hours, and we would use that time to gain some more experience. Both of us were close to getting another skill, and I could tell that he was as eager as I was to get another skill. I had given my next skill a lot of thought and still hadn't decided what route I wanted to take. I knew for sure that I didn't want another generic skill like identify. I wanted something to make me stronger. Meditation was tempting, but all it would do would help me recover faster after a battle and wouldn't help during. I was either leaning towards another offensive skill like penetrating strike or getting another defensive skill like shield wall. It was a question of what role I wanted to play in the battles going forward. Austin and I worked well together, and we split the attention of the beasts we fought, neither of us tanking it alone. I could lean toward being the tank while Austin dealt the damage, or I could lean toward dealing damage myself. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and it had been on my mind for a while. A magic attack like Mana Bolt or Ice Bolt was an option, but I didn't think it would be as good as something else. I already had one throwing skill for a ranged attack and didn't think getting another would be a good idea. During the wave where I was surrounded by the weak rodents, an area skill would have been helpful, but that wouldn't be as useful during the hunts that I went on where we only faced one monster at a time. There were too many options to choose from, and I wanted them all. I pushed those thoughts from my mind as we walked toward the forest and focused my mind on our surroundings. There wasn't anything this close to our camp, but it was good practice to be aware of your surroundings. Even though we had faced a wave already today, and whatever could be called the one after, we still had the energy to hunt some more. There's no rest for the wicked, or so they say, and we had no time to relax. We were ahead of the waves in terms of level and were determined to keep it that way. There was another reason that I wanted to go hunt something, but I wasn't going to say it out loud. I felt unsatisfied from the goblin wave. It was a weird feeling to have, and it was new, but it didn't change the way I felt. It was like a tease of a wave without the satisfaction of a battle. I was all amped and ready to face down a dangerous wave, but instead of a brutal fight, it was a slaughter that was barely worth it. I barely got any experience and a pittance worth of points. It was worrying to notice how different I felt now from the start of the tutorial and realize that only 2 weeks ago I would have been considered a psychopath. I had turned from a person whose only battle experience was in video games into someone unsatisfied with an easy fight. It made me wonder if this was who I was the whole time, or if this experience turned me into someone who liked battle. It was infinitely better than being a coward, but was something to keep an eye on all the same. We gathered our gear and spent the time until dark exterminating as many boars as we could find. Neither of us leveled up, but we were closer now than we once were, and that was the point. We leveled yesterday, and this morning so hoping for another was too much. While we were walking back into camp, there was something off in the ambience. There was this underlying tension that stuck out from the usual cheerfulness that should be going on around this time. We still hadn't gotten back to where we were from before Derek. But this was different. Something happened. I looked myself over to see if there was any evidence of battle, to see if it was me who caused it, but didn't find anything. Austin looked fine as well, so it shouldn't have been us. It was then that I noticed that people were shooting glances toward the new wooden cabin that was in the middle of the camp, like they were trying to see what was going on themselves. I saw my dad standing nearby and walked over to him. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Nothing's wrong. Just unexpected is all," he answered. "What is it?" I said. "We have a visitor," he said. Chapter 20, What You're Made Of. "We have a visitor?" I asked. What did he mean that we had a visitor? There shouldn't be anyone around for miles, and even then they would have to trek through a forest filled with monsters to get here. The only thing that I could think of would be if someone from a pylon nearby sent a scout or something to contact us. The only question then would be why. Yes, he showed up not that long ago, and he was brought to the cabin so he and Granddad could speak in private. Abigail is in there with them, but that's it. Kyle saw his level, and he's already level 10 with a different class than the starting 5. He said, "Wait, there's a level 10 visitor in there, and he's alone with only Granddad and Abigail. What if he kills them or takes them hostage?" I said, starting to panic. My dad just gave me a curious look before saying, "How far do you think humanity has fallen? It's only been 2 weeks and you already jumped to murder." Why did I immediately go dark? It would be nice to think that my first thought wasn't immediately murder, but that would be a lie. Well, what are they doing in there anyway? And how can we trust this guy? I asked. I felt that it was a little too trusting to let this guy into our camp just because he said he was a visitor from another pylon. This was technically the apocalypse, and every movie ever made about the apocalypse says to be wary of outsiders. Son, he's surrounded by all of us. Even if something goes wrong, we have him surrounded. Not that it will. Plus, all those movies are getting to your head. They only highlight the bad things about the situation. Dad said. Also, a man's word means more now that there are no laws to protect you. If it's broken, then it's never coming back. He is a guest, and as such we must treat him accordingly. He added, "What is this Game of Thrones, where there are certain rules of hospitality implied while one is a guest? It isn't the Middle Ages, I don't think those exist anymore." I said back. Dad just looked at me. Even in ancient times there were rules that were followed, and they were followed for a reason. Imagine if there weren't. Everyone would be suspicious of everyone else. No one would leave their settlement. Everyone would hole up inside and never allow newcomers in. "Is that what you want to happen?" he asked. "No. But how do you know that this visitor is worthy of trust? Or anyone else for that matter?" I asked back. "You don't, son. That is why a man's word means so much now. Once it is known that you are a person to go back on your word or do something like kill a guest, it will never go away. Word will spread, and everyone will know that you are unworthy of trust," he said. I wasn't inclined to believe him. People could do some truly awful things, and being too trusting was asking for something bad to happen. I wanted to reply that word couldn't spread if you killed everyone who knew, but didn't wish to continue this argument. There were more pressing matters. "What does this guy want exactly?" I asked. "I don't know for certain, since I'm clearly not in there to hear the conversation. But from what I heard from before they went to the cabin, they wish for an alliance. I think that their camp isn't handling this whole thing very well and are seeking help from anyone nearby," he said. "What does he mean by not handling it very well?" "The guy's level 10. Austin and I were the highest level here, and we just hit level 7 today. The only way he's already level 10 was through a lot of blood. Some that could be human. I was extremely against anything to do with outsiders, especially anyone who was stronger than me. At least this proved that there was a class evolution at level 10, and we got some useful information out of this. Seeing other people outlevel me showed that I needed to put more effort into hunting. I wasn't fast enough. I separated from my dad and tried to stand as close to the cabin as I could without looking suspicious. It didn't take long for their conversation to end, and soon I saw him leaving the building with my grandfather and sister in tow. I used Identify as soon as I saw him. Human, level 10. The amount of information that the skill gave was lackluster, but it confirmed his level. We had used the skill on each other before, and it always gave the same information. It was still at its lowest rarity, and we thought that higher levels of Identify would tell you more. He seemed like a normal guy that you could see anywhere. He had short brown hair with the beginnings of a beard growing on his face. He was a couple of inches shorter than me, just under 6 foot tall, and his armor looked in worse condition than mine. My armor had seen better days. There were scratches all over it, and there was a hole in it from where a boar's tusk stabbed through it. But his was even worse. His looked mismatched, and some were definitely from different sets. He had a bow on his back, but he was covered in the full leather of a warrior. There were deep scratch marks down the breastplate, and the bracers had a huge bite mark on it that looked like it hurt. There were other marks and blemishes, but none that stood out like those. But even that proved the amount of battles he had been in. He didn't stop anywhere else and continued out the gate before disappearing into the forest, presumably back from where he came. I and everyone else had a host of questions about the whole interaction, and Granddad took the time to explain it to everyone. Apparently, this guy was part of another faction to the south that was made up of a bunch of college kids who were all a part of the same club. After the wave of boars, where we lost Derek, they ended up losing 4 people to that wave alone. After the battle, there was a huge fight between everyone where friends of the people who died blamed the others, and it all escalated to the point where some refused to fight together and wouldn't contribute points toward defensive structures for the camp. Supposedly, they didn't even have a wall yet. It only got worse after the last wave, where they didn't participate in the fight and watched as the rest of the group fought the wave alone, where another person died. Now that it had gotten so bad, instead of fighting the waves with half of the group, the leader of the fighters sought out nearby pylons to see about joining with them instead and leave where they were. Granddad went on to say that he had refused the offer and said that it would be a bad idea to allow outsiders in. I agreed with him, but some thought it was the wrong decision. I knew that the more people we had, the easier the waves would be, but there was no guarantee that more people wouldn't make the waves harder. Also, we had no idea who these people were, and we had kids here that we had to think about. We all spent the time until dinner talking about the whole thing, but it didn't interest me as much as other people. All I saw was someone who was higher level than me and was stronger than me. I could say that I wasn't jealous, but that wouldn't entirely be true. A part of me wanted to go back into the woods and keep hunting down boars, but I stopped myself from that idea. Being impulsive was bound to result in wounds, and those wouldn't help in catching up. It was already dark, and hunting now was asking for an injury. I took to the hunt the next day with more intensity than before, and Austin did the same. I could tell that he was feeling behind as well, and we both did our best to catch up. We stopped using the spikes and stuck to hunting with just our weapons and javelins. The spikes took too long to set up, and we had enough experience now that we could fight without them. We started targeting higher and higher level boars, and we were currently looking at the highest level one yet. Earthhide boar, level 10. After easily handling the level 7 and 8 boars, we moved up to level 9s. With some good first shots with the javelins, we could then take it down easily with our weapons. With the confidence of killing a level 9, we thought to increase to a level 10. This boar was different though. We already knew that our class evolved at level 10, and it seemed that animals got a mutation as well. This boar was different from the others in that its skin looked like hardened earth packed onto it. It looked like it was wearing a layer of earth as armor, and that wasn't the only difference. Felt strong. I don't know how I felt it, but something about it was telling me not to mess with it. I looked at Austin to make sure we were on the same page, and he nodded. No pain, no gain. That was all he said. We both took aim and threw the javelins with all our might. It would take all we could to get through the thing's armor. Watching the javelins bounce off should have been our first clue to run away, but we were committed. I ran in front with Austin behind me, as we had done countless times before, and charged toward the boar who just now noticed us. Over the countless fights with the boars, we found that the easiest way to keep them from charging you was to close the distance first. We both ran full speed toward the beast and reached it before it could build up much momentum. I went to block it with my shield, while Austin went around the side to stab it. When the boar collided with my shield, it hit so hard that it nearly flew from my hand. I had learned early that deflecting attacks was way better than taking them head-on. Even though I angled my shield so that the boar wouldn't hit head-on, I still felt the impact go through my whole body. My arm felt numb and the shock jarred the rest of my body. I still blocked the charge, but it was way more powerful than I thought it would be. The boar had only just begun to build up speed, yet it felt like the full tilt charge of a level 6. That should have been our second clue. After the boar's charge was negated, Austin's glowing spear came in from the side, hitting right in between where its ribs should be. With the amount of practice that we had gotten pretty good at hitting the spots we were aiming at. When the tutorial first began, I was lucky to land a blow within a couple of inches of where I aimed. Now it was within an inch. There were times when the angle was off, but those were few and far between. Austin was even better with his spear. The consequence of lunging so hard with piercing strike activated and missing was devastating. If he hit a bone, his spear would get stuck, and the unexpected stop would leave him open to a counterattack he had no way to block. After a few times of getting launched in the air after a bad attack, he learned quickly. He could now attack with such precision to go between the ribcage, leading to some truly devastating attacks. Watching the spear that would normally go almost a foot into other boars stop after only a few inches should have been our third clue. It was too late to disengage now, and we were in it for the long haul. Conserve your strength. We are going to have to whittle this guy down, I shouted to Austin. My attacks were less powerful than his full-powered spear, and that barely did anything. We would have to chip down and see who ran out of strength first. Endurance was one of my highest stats, and I could only hope that I could outlast it. Every time I blocked with my shield, it felt like stopping a bus. The impact wasn't confined to my arm. It spread through my entire body. I was determined to block it and had to use a lot of effort, and the boar wasn't making it easy. When the boar turned toward Austin, I would swing my axe as hard as I could, only to watch the glowing axe chip off some earth. It felt like I was hitting a stone wall, its hide was so hard. I concentrated my attacks in the same spot, and I knew I would eventually break through, but it would take time. Austin wasn't faring any better than I was, and he couldn't block as well as I could, so he had to keep dodging out of the way. Focus on its legs so we can cripple it, Austin shouted from the other side of the boar. Oh, thanks, genius. I thought I would try to decapitate it instead, I said back. This was no time for jokes, but that was just too stupid a comment to not be sarcastic about. We both knew what we were doing by this point, and focusing on the leg was common sense. If we could cripple its movement, it was only a matter of time before we killed it. It was the longest fight we had been in so far, and I would go as far as to say the strongest foe we faced. We usually fought the bosses of the wave with overwhelming numbers, and this thing felt stronger than them. Even when it felt that my body would give out, I kept going. Even when I couldn't activate fortified body anymore, I kept going. I would not be defeated by a mere beast, and I certainly wasn't going to lose to a boar of all things. If I was going to lose to a beast, at least make it a mythic one, like a dragon or something. I know that's just hubris talking, but who wants to say that they got defeated by a boar? Austin was all but dead on his feet by this point, but I pushed through. I wasn't going to lose. The boar was sluggish and late to turn in between us, and I used that to my advantage. When before I had to be quick and attack before it turned back around, now I could take my time. I couldn't dilly-dally or anything, but I could make sure that all of my swings landed precisely where I wanted them to. It was reminiscent of working my way through the trunk of a tree. Every inch of hard-packed dirt I made it through was one less between me and my goal. Something would have to give eventually, and I was damn sure it wasn't going to be me. Every thud from my axe resulted in dirt crumbling off. Thud, thud. I was in the zone. I blocked out everything that was unnecessary. The sounds of the trees blowing in the breeze quieted and the chirping of birds fell away. The only thing that mattered was me and the boar. On my last swing, it finally revealed the prize I sought after. Bare skin. My next swing drew blood and the boar went into a frenzy. It probably thought that nothing could make it through its armor of earth. It didn't expect some crazy person to relentlessly chip away at what was keeping it safe. I was through the hard part now, all I had to do was finish it. It didn't take long to make it to bone after that, and the boar completely disregarded Austin to focus on me. I could only pray Austin had enough strength left to cripple the limb because the boar wasn't giving me a chance to continue hacking at its leg. It was taking everything in me to keep my shield up and not fall over in exhaustion. I could catch glimpses of Austin behind the boar, but they never lasted long enough to know what he was doing. He must have hit something important because the boar let out a particularly loud squeal and spun around to face him. With the new wound facing me, I now saw a fountain of blood running down the boar's leg. It looked like he hit an artery by the amount of blood coming out. It would take time to die, but it wouldn't be able to survive the blood loss. It must have come to the same realization because it started going into its death throes. I didn't know if we would be able to last long enough until it bled out, and there was only one way I could think to speed it up: to take off the leg. I gathered every scrap of mana left in me and shoved it all into Power Strike to deal one last blow. The skill wasn't designed to take this much mana, but I didn't much care right now. I was either going to remove the leg or die trying. It was time to find out what I was made of. After I gathered every scrap of mana I had, I pushed my body for all it was worth. I let out a primal roar before bringing my axe down onto the boar's leg. I don't know if it was all the attacks we already made in the same spot, or if this one was particularly powerful, but it cut through smoother than before. It sliced through what was left of the muscle and bone and stopped just short of exiting out the other side. The last thing I saw before blacking out was the boar's leg flapping around like a flag in the wind. I did it. End of chapter 20.